She was worth $4 billion, owned 3 skyscrapers, and had turned down a sitting senator's dinner invitation without blinking. But on a Tuesday evening in October, with the city lights bleeding orange through her floor-to-ceiling windows, Ava Sterling looked at a man who worked for her, a widowed father who still packed dinosaur-shaped sandwiches in his kid's lunchbox, and asked a question so unguarded, so raw, that it cracked something open in both of them. Is she prettier than me? 4 words. No context. No explanation. And somehow, everything that followed started right there. If this story sounds like yours, if you've ever loved someone you weren't supposed to, or held your life together with nothing but stubbornness and a child who needed you, hit like, drop a comment with your city, and let me watch how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it really began. Ryan Foster had a rule about women like Ava Sterling. Don't look too long, don't think too hard. And whatever you do, don't let yourself imagine anything. It wasn't a complicated rule, it was survival. The kind of quiet, self-imposed discipline that a man develops after 4 years of raising a kid alone, after 4 years of learning that wanting things you can't have doesn't hurt you less just because you understand why you can't have them. It just hurts differently. Quieter. In the middle of the night, usually, when Mason was asleep down the hall, and the apartment was so still you could hear the refrigerator hum, Ryan had gotten very good at not wanting things. But rules have a way of breaking on the most ordinary of evenings. It was a Tuesday. October. The kind of city evening where the sky couldn't decide whether it wanted to be purple or gray, and the wind coming off the water smelled faintly like rain that hadn't arrived yet. Ryan had been at his desk since 7 that morning. His neck ached. His third coffee had gone cold somewhere around 3 in the afternoon, and he'd drunk it anyway because stopping felt like a luxury he hadn't earned yet. He worked in the software architecture division of Sterling Technologies, 43rd floor of the North Tower, a glass and steel building that Ava Sterling had commissioned 6 years ago and which still occasionally appeared in architecture magazines. Ryan's team handled back-end infrastructure for the company's flagship analytics platform. Important work, largely invisible, the kind that only got attention when something went wrong. He was good at it. Exceptionally good, actually, though he'd long stopped needing anyone to tell him that. The report he was delivering to Ava's office that evening was a routine quarterly analysis. 62 pages of system performance metrics, redundancy protocols, and projected server load for Q1. He'd written most of it himself over the previous 2 weeks, stealing hours after Mason went to bed, his kitchen table covered in coffee cups and sticky notes, and the occasional crayon drawing that his son had left in places Ryan kept finding them, inside his laptop bag, tucked into his notebook, once memorably folded inside a server manual he'd been using as reference. He rode the elevator to the 58th floor with the report folder tucked under his arm and his jacket buttoned because that floor always ran cold. It was a small thing, but he'd learned it months ago. Ava kept the temperature in her suite low enough that most people who visited her crossed their arms within 10 minutes without realizing they were doing it. He'd always thought that was deliberate. Ava Sterling's executive suite occupied the entire northeast corner of the building's top commercial floor. The reception area alone was larger than Ryan's apartment. The woman who managed her calendar, a composed, unsmiling professional named Denise, who wore her hair pulled so tight it seemed to affect her facial expressions, nodded when Ryan stepped off the elevator and gestured toward the inner office without speaking. "She's expecting you?" Ryan asked, even though he'd confirmed the appointment twice. "She's aware," Denise said, which wasn't exactly the same thing, but would have to do. He pushed through the heavy glass door. Ava was standing at the window. She did that sometimes, just stood there, facing the city. Ryan had been in this office a total of 7 times in his 3 years with Sterling Technologies. 3 of those times, she'd been standing exactly like that. He'd come to think of it as her default state when she was working through something, the way other people paced or drummed their fingers or stared at the ceiling. Ava Sterling stood at her window and looked at the city like she was waiting for it to give her something back. She was 30 years old, 5'7" in flat shoes. She rarely wore heels, which Ryan had always found interesting in a woman who had every reason to want to appear taller than everyone in the room. Her dark hair was down tonight, which was unusual. She almost always wore it pulled back during business hours. She had on a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, and there was a pair of reading glasses sitting on the corner of her desk that she clearly hadn't put away in time before he came in. And for some reason, that small detail, the glasses left out, slightly askew, made her seem more real than the 80-page profile Forbes had run on her last spring. "Foster," she said, without turning around, "the Q3 infrastructure report." He crossed the room and set the folder on her desk beside a half-eaten container of what looked like Thai takeout that had definitely been there for more than one meal. 62 pages, executive summaries on top. I flagged 2 items I think you'll want to look at separately: the load projection for the Eastern data cluster and the redundancy gap we found in the secondary backup system. "How bad is the gap?" "Manageable. We've already started the patch protocol, but you should know it existed." He paused. "I thought you'd want to know." She turned from the window then. Her eyes moved to the folder, then back to him, with the kind of quick, assessing look that Ryan had learned meant she was deciding how much attention a thing deserved. He'd watched her do that in board meetings, in corridor conversations, in the 30-second elevator ride she'd once shared with his entire team during a fire drill that turned out to be a false alarm. Ava Sterling never looked at anything without deciding exactly how much of herself to give it. "Thank you for flagging it directly," she said. "Most people bury things like that in the appendix. Most people are hoping you won't notice until they've already fixed it so they can take the credit." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, more like the beginning of one that she decided not to finish. "Sit down, Foster. Walk me through the Eastern cluster projections." He stayed 20 minutes longer than he'd planned. That happened sometimes with Ava. She had the ability to extend a meeting without technically extending it, asking a follow-up question just as you were gathering your things, circling back to something you'd mentioned in passing in a way that made it clear she'd been holding it in reserve, waiting to see if you'd bring it up yourself. It wasn't manipulative, exactly. It was just thorough. She was the most thorough person Ryan had ever met, and he'd spent 3 years working in a division full of people whose entire professional identity was built on thoroughness. By the time they'd worked through the cluster projections, and she'd asked 2 questions about the backup protocol that Ryan had to write down, because they were genuinely things his team hadn't considered yet, it was 7:15. He closed his notebook, started to stand. "You seem distracted," Ava said. He looked up. "I'm sorry?" "You've been checking your watch, not obviously, but you have." She wasn't accusatory, just observational, like she was noting weather patterns. "You don't usually do that." Ryan hesitated. This was the kind of personal territory he'd always been careful about with her. With anyone in this building, honestly, but especially with her. He'd watched other people make the mistake of treating Ava Sterling like a confidant because she sometimes asked questions that felt personal. They forgot that she was also the person who signed their performance reviews, but she was looking at him in a way that was different tonight. Something in her posture was different, less CEO, more just person. "I have dinner plans," he said. "Personal." A beat of silence. "A date?" Something like that. He watched her take that in. Her face didn't change, not really, but she went still in a way that was slightly different from her usual stillness. "First one in a while?" she asked. He almost deflected. Old habit, but something about the directness of the question, and the evening, and the fact that he was tired enough that his usual filters weren't operating at full capacity, made him answer honestly. "First in about 2 years. She nodded once, slowly. "What's her name?" "Claire." He picked up the report folder. "We met through a mutual friend. She's a landscape architect." "Sounds nice." "Yeah." He moved toward the door. She seems great on paper." "On paper," Ava repeated. "People are complicated," he said. It came out more resigned than he meant it to. He was already thinking about Mason, whether Mrs. Paulson next door had the right bedtime instructions, whether he'd remembered to leave the hall light on. He was almost to the door. "Foster." He turned. Ava was still standing beside the desk. She wasn't looking at him the way she looked at her window. That patient, waiting look. She was looking at him directly. And there was something in her expression that he hadn't seen there before. Something unguarded. Something that didn't fit neatly into any of the categories he'd mentally assigned to her over 3 years of working in the same building. "Is she prettier than me?" The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Ryan stood there with one hand on the doorframe and his brain doing something he could only describe as stalling, the human equivalent of a loading screen. He couldn't tell if he'd heard her correctly. He ran the words back. Is she prettier than me? He had not misheard her. Ava Sterling, Forbes profile billionaire, empire builder, the woman whose conference calls had reportedly made grown men cry, was standing in the middle of her own 58th floor office asking a widowed software engineer whether his date was prettier than her. And she was serious. That was the part that really got him. She wasn't being arch. She wasn't performing some kind of power move he wasn't smart enough to decode. The question had come out the way questions come out when you ask them before you've decided whether you actually want the answer. Impulsive, slightly rough around the edges, carrying something real underneath. Ryan started. He stopped. He genuinely didn't know what to say, not because he didn't have an answer, but because having an answer felt suddenly dangerous in a way he hadn't anticipated when he walked in here an hour ago with a report folder and an aching neck. That's a complicated question, he said finally. It's 4 words. Yeah, well, he exhaled. I'll see you Thursday, Ms. Sterling. He walked out before she could say anything else. The elevator ride down was 43 seconds. He counted them. He spent approximately 38 of those seconds not thinking about the question, which meant he spent all 43 seconds thinking about it. The lobby was nearly empty at this hour. A security guard at the desk, a woman in marketing he recognized but couldn't name clicking past in heels toward the revolving doors, the soft ambient sound of the building's ventilation system doing its quiet, continuous work. Ryan pushed through the doors into the October air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the cold hit him. Why had she asked that? He knew her reputation, obviously. Everyone in the building knew the broad strokes of Ava Sterling's personal life, or rather, the conspicuous absence of one. She'd been linked to various people over the years in the way that wealthy, powerful, photogenic women inevitably were, but nothing had ever seemed to stick, and she'd never confirmed or denied anything publicly. She didn't do interviews about her personal life. She didn't do personal life, as far as anyone could tell. She had sterling technologies, and she had the 2 philanthropic foundations she'd established at 26, and she had a schedule that reportedly required 2 full-time assistants to maintain, and that was the sum of what the world knew about Ava Sterling as a human being rather than a brand. What Ryan knew from 3 years of proximity was marginally more. He knew she took her coffee black with an embarrassing amount of sugar that she hid behind a closed cabinet door. He knew that she had a habit of writing in the margins of documents in a cramped, left-handed script that was nearly illegible to anyone but her. He knew that she once, during a company-wide budget crisis, had quietly personally covered the medical expenses of an accounts assistant whose insurance had lapsed, and that she'd told Denise specifically to make sure the assistant never found out it had been her. He knew that she was not as impenetrable as she worked very hard to appear, but that question, 4 words, offered with that strange, unguarded vulnerability. That was new territory. He turned up his collar against the wind and went to meet Claire. The restaurant was a Mediterranean place in Midtown that Claire had suggested. Warm lighting, good wine list, the kind of place where you could hear your own conversation without straining. She was already there when he arrived, a few minutes early, which he noted as a good sign, and she stood when she saw him coming, and she smiled, and she was objectively very attractive, and he thought, okay, this is fine, this is good. Ryan, she said, extending her hand, which struck him as slightly formal, but he decided to chalk up to nerves. It's great to finally put a face to the name. You too. He shook her hand. Sorry if I'm a little... You're exactly on time. Right. Good. He sat down, picked up the menu, put it down without reading it, picked it up again. Claire was 31, worked for a boutique landscape architecture firm that did mostly commercial projects, had gone to school in Boston, and had what their mutual friend Dana had described as an incredibly easy personality, which you need, Ryan, because you have a complicated one. She had warm brown eyes and a way of tilting her head when she listened that suggested genuine attention. She asked him questions rather than waiting for him to ask her questions, which Ryan always appreciated because he was constitutionally better at answering than initiating. For the first 40 minutes, it was genuinely fine. Better than fine, actually. They found a rhythm. She had opinions about things, real opinions, not hedged, socially acceptable positions, and she defended them with a light humor that kept the conversation moving without making it feel like a debate. She talked about a project she was finishing in the financial district, a rooftop garden for a law firm that kept changing the brief. She complained about it with a weariness that made Ryan feel immediately comfortable, because it was the same weariness he carried everywhere and he recognized it. He relaxed, ordered a second glass of wine, started to think that maybe Dana had been right, and that this was, in fact, a reasonable thing to do. Sit across from someone and have a conversation that wasn't about server load or pediatric fever management or whether Mason had remembered to brush his back teeth. Then she asked about his life. Not in a bad way, it was a natural progression. He'd asked about hers. She asked about his. He told her about the job. She seemed interested in the technical aspects in the same way people were interested in geology. Vaguely fascinated, not particularly invested in understanding the details. Then she asked if he had kids. He told her about Mason. There was a shift in her posture, subtle, the kind of thing he'd learned to spot the way you learn to spot weather changes after enough seasons of being caught without an umbrella. "How old is he?" she asked. 8. He'll be 9 in March. Ryan found himself smiling without meaning to, the way he always did when Mason came up unexpectedly. He's obsessed with dinosaurs, like aggressively. We have a poster of the Cretaceous period on the kitchen ceiling because he wanted to look at it while he eats breakfast. Claire laughed. It was genuine, but there was something careful behind it. "That's adorable," she said. "It's a lot," he said honestly, because he'd learned that pretending otherwise didn't do anyone any favors. "I do most of the parenting solo. His mom passed 4 years ago, so it's me and Mason and a babysitter named Mrs. Paulson, who is 73 and has more patience than anyone I've ever met, and that's the team." Silence. The specific quality of silence that he'd learned to recognize over 2 years of occasional attempts at dating. Claire set her wine glass down carefully. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said. And she meant it. He could tell she meant it. That must have been... I can't imagine. It was hard. It's still hard in different ways. He picked his napkin up, set it back down. But Mason's a good kid. He's a really good kid. He sounds like it. She was choosing her words with a care that was itself a kind of answer. "Can I ask, do you date much? I mean, have you..." "Not much, no." He was trying to make it easy for her. "I know it's a package deal. That's not something I'd ever try to obscure." Claire looked at him for a long moment. She wasn't unkind. Whatever she was about to say, she was clearly trying to find a way to say it that didn't feel like rejection, and Ryan found himself respecting her for that, even as he felt the familiar weight settling back onto his shoulders. "I think you're a really impressive person," she said. "And I'm not just saying that. What you've done, raising a kid alone, keeping everything together, that takes something." "But," he said, "but I'm 31, and I just moved back from London 6 months ago, and I haven't figured out what I want yet, and I think..." She stopped. "I think I'd be doing you a disservice if I let this go further, knowing I'm not in a place for what your life actually looks like." Ryan nodded. He kept his face neutral because he'd had practice at this, and because she was being honest, and honest deserved something better than visible hurt. "I appreciate you saying that directly," he said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." He picked up his wine. "I mean that." They finished their meals because they were both adults, and the food was good, and there was no reason to be dramatic about it. The conversation loosened once the pressure of possibility was gone. They talked about Boston, about a documentary she'd seen recently, about whether the neighborhood was getting better or just getting more expensive, which, as she pointed out, were sometimes mistaken for the same thing. They parted on the sidewalk with the kind of hug that means "I genuinely wish you well, but we will never see each other again." And Ryan stood there watching a cab take her north and thought, yeah, okay, fine. He was used to this. He'd built a life around being used to things. He had his hands in his pockets and was already recalibrating toward getting home. Subway, 3 stops, left on Carver, buzz up, check on Mason, find something forgettable to watch until he fell asleep, when his phone vibrated. A text message. Unknown number, which he almost ignored on principle. This is Ava Sterling. Denise gave me your cell for professional purposes, so don't worry. I heard the dinner didn't go well. Are you still in Midtown? Ryan stared at the screen for a full 5 seconds. Then he typed back, "How did you hear that?" The response came in under a minute. "Dana works in our marketing division. Small world. Are you still in Midtown?" He looked up at the street. The wind had gotten colder. A taxi splashed through a puddle near the curb, and a man in a very good coat made a sound of extreme displeasure. "Yes," he typed. "Why?" 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. "Because I'd like to buy you a coffee, and I know a place 2 blocks from where you're probably standing. And before you overthink it, I'm not your boss right now. I'm just a person who didn't feel like being alone tonight either." Ryan read that last line twice. He thought about the question she'd asked in her office. Is she prettier than me? The particular quality of her voice when she'd asked it, like something had slipped out from somewhere she kept things carefully stored. He thought about 4 years of keeping his life small and manageable and safe. He thought about Mason's dinosaur ceiling poster and Mrs. Paulson's patience and the way his apartment felt on the nights when the quiet stopped being peaceful and started being just quiet. He typed back, "What's the name of the place?" "What?" The cafe was called Oleander. It occupied the ground floor of a building that looked like it had been inserted between 2 larger, more serious buildings sometime in the 1940s and had resisted every subsequent attempt at modernization. Exposed brick walls, mismatched chairs, the kind of lighting that was low enough to feel like evening regardless of what time it was outside. It smelled like coffee and something baked with cardamom, and underneath that, old wood. Ava was already there when he arrived. She was at a corner table, her blazer folded over the back of the chair, her dark hair still down, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug. Without the office around her, without the floor-to-ceiling windows and the 58th floor altitude and all the architecture of power that surrounded her professional life, she looked smaller, not in a diminished way, in a human way, in the way that people look when you see them somewhere they haven't built a performance around. She looked up when he walked in. "You came," she said. "You said you knew a place." "I did." He sat down across from her. A server appeared almost immediately. The cafe had 5 other occupied tables and the staff seemed attentive. And he ordered coffee, black, and a piece of whatever the cardamom thing was because he hadn't eaten much at dinner and he was cold. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly. It was the specific silence of 2 people who have spent 3 years in the same building being professionally cordial and are now sitting across from each other without the professional part and are quietly negotiating what that means. "The question," he said. She didn't pretend not to know what he meant. "Yeah. You want to explain that?" Ava turned her mug between her palms, looked at the table, then looked back up at him with the directness that he'd always associated with her in professional settings, but which felt different now, less strategic, more just how she actually was when she wasn't trying to manage anyone's impression of her. "I don't know that I can explain it," she said. "It came out before I'd thought it through. Usually those are the truest things. Usually." She pressed her lips together. "How was dinner, beyond what Dana apparently reported to the gossip chain?" "It was fine. She was kind about it." He shrugged. "She didn't want someone else's kid." "Sorry. People are honest about what they want when they think about it long enough. I'd rather have that than the alternative." The alternative being someone who decides 6 months in that it's too much. He looked at her. "I've had that too. It's worse." Ava was quiet. Not the considering her next move quiet he was used to from her, just quiet, sitting with what he'd said. "How's Mason?" she asked. It was the last question he expected. "Good," he said, a little caught off guard. "He's 8. He broke a toe last month falling off a bookshelf he wasn't supposed to be climbing. He cried for about 4 minutes and then asked if dinosaurs ever broke their toes, so we had to look it up." Something happened to her face then. It wasn't the almost smile from earlier. It was something warmer and less managed. "Do they? Break their toes?" "Apparently yes, There are fossil records, so that actually turned into an educational moment, which felt like a minor miracle. She laughed. A real one, short and sudden, like she'd been startled by it. It didn't sound like the professional laugh he'd heard in meetings, when someone made a joke that wasn't quite funny enough but deserved acknowledgement. This was a different sound entirely. The cardamom pastry arrived. He broke a piece off and, without particularly thinking about it, pushed the plate toward the middle of the table. She hesitated for just a second. Then she reached over and took a piece. That small shared act, the broken pastry, the unplanned split, the entirely mundane intimacy of it, sat in the middle of the table between them and changed the atmosphere of the conversation in a way Ryan couldn't have articulated but felt clearly. "I owe you an actual answer," he said. She looked at him. To the question. He met her eyes. "The honest answer is that I didn't think about it. I walked in there tonight thinking about my son and my job and whether I'd left the right snacks in the apartment and whether I was even capable anymore of doing the thing you're supposed to do on a first date, which is be present and interested and available. That's a lot to carry into a restaurant." "Is that why it didn't work?" "Partly." He looked at his coffee. "But I also think I already knew it wasn't going to work before I sat down." "Why?" He didn't answer right away. The cafe made its small sounds around them. A spoon against ceramic, a chair shifting, the low murmur of other conversations. "Because I was in my boss's office at 7 in the evening, talking about server redundancy," he said carefully, "and the most I'd thought about that dinner all day was whether I needed to change my jacket." Ava was very still. "And then she asked a question," he continued, looking at her directly now, "that I've been thinking about ever since." She held his gaze. Outside, a bus went past, and the low rumble of it moved through the floor and the walls, and then faded. "I'm not—" She stopped, restarted. "I want to be clear about something. I'm not trying to run some kind of play here. I know what that would look like. I know people would make assumptions about power, about the job, about what I could possibly want with a what?" She looked frustrated with herself. "With someone who has every reason to be careful around me." "I'm not worried about the power thing," Ryan said. "I'm an adult. You're an adult." He paused. "I'm more worried about the part where you asked me that question and it clearly meant something to you and I didn't answer it, and now we're sitting here and I still haven't answered it, and I think that matters." She waited. "She's attractive," he said. "Claire. She's warm and she's smart and she was good company until she wasn't." He put both hands flat on the table. "And no, she wasn't prettier than you, but I don't think that's actually what you were asking." Ava was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "It wasn't." "What were you asking?" She looked at him. The cafe light caught the edge of her face, and she looked nothing like a $4 billion enterprise, and everything like someone who had been managing loneliness so effectively for so long that she'd almost convinced herself it was a personality trait. "I was asking if you'd already stopped noticing me," she said, "whether I'd already missed it." Ryan felt something in his chest, not a dramatic thing, not a sudden revelation, but something quieter, a settling, like a piece of weight redistributing itself into a more bearable configuration. "No," he said, "you hadn't missed it." She exhaled, just slightly, just enough. They sat there for another hour, their coffee going cold and neither of them particularly minding. They talked about things that had nothing to do with Sterling Technologies, about the city and the way it changed over years, about what grief did to your relationship with time, about the specific texture of loneliness that was different from being alone. They talked in the way people talked when they'd been carrying separate weights for a long time and had suddenly found themselves at the same table. Ryan didn't think about whether it was wise. He thought about it later, walking home, but sitting there in Oleander with Ava Sterling and a half-eaten cardamom pastry, he just let it be what it was. Something starting, something neither of them had planned. He didn't know, walking home that night with his hands in his pockets and the October wind at his back, that 3 hours later his phone would ring and his chest would tighten with the particular fear that only parents knew. He didn't know that the evening wasn't over. He didn't know that the next 12 hours would teach him something about the woman he'd just shared a table with that no quarterly report and no Forbes profile had ever come close to showing. He only knew that for the first time in a long time, the quiet of his walk home felt different, less like absence, more like waiting. He made it home by 11. Mrs. Paulson was asleep in the armchair by the television. She always fell asleep in the armchair, had been doing it for 3 years, and Ryan had long since stopped feeling guilty about it and started leaving a blanket folded on the armrest for her. The television was running a nature documentary on low volume, something about migratory birds. The apartment smelled like the mac and cheese Mason always requested when Ryan wasn't home to cook anything more ambitious, and the kitchen light had been left on, which Mason also always did, a habit Ryan had tried to break approximately 40 times without success. He paid Mrs. Paulson, walked her to the door, and stood in the hallway for a moment after she left, letting the apartment settle around him. Then he went to check on Mason. His son was 8 years old and slept like a crime scene, limbs everywhere, blanket half on the floor, one sock on and one sock mysteriously absent, a library book face down on the pillow beside him, with the spine bent in a way that would have horrified a librarian. Ryan straightened the blanket without waking him, found the other sock under the mattress edge, picked up the book and set it on the nightstand. These were the small rituals that nobody documented, the unremarkable mechanics of loving a child, repetitive and mundane, and occasionally, in certain lights, the most important thing he did in any given day. Mason's cheeks were flushed. Ryan paused, pressed the back of his hand to his son's forehead. Warm. Maybe nothing. Kids ran warm sometimes, especially after a day of activity, and Mason had the thermostat regulation of a small furnace on his best days. But something in the back of Ryan's mind flagged it quietly, the way a parent's instinct flagged things. Pay attention. Not urgent. Not yet. But pay attention. He went to bed thinking it was nothing. By 2 in the morning, he knew it was something. Mason's crying wasn't frantic. It was the low, miserable kind that meant he'd been awake for a while before he'd let himself call out, which was a thing his son did, holding discomfort privately until it got too large to hold. Ryan was in the doorway before he was fully awake, body moving before his brain had finished its startup sequence. Hey, bud. He crossed the room, sat on the edge of the bed, put his hand on Mason's face. Hot, genuinely hot this time. How long have you been awake? I don't know. Mason's voice was thick and rough. My head hurts. Where? Here? He pressed gently along his temples. Everywhere. Ryan looked at his son's face in the ambient glow of the dinosaur nightlight on the dresser, a small ceramic T-Rex that emitted a faint orange light, purchased at a museum gift shop 11 months ago and since elevated to a position of non-negotiable necessity. Mason's eyes were glassy, not alarmingly so, but enough. Okay. He pulled the blanket up properly. I'm getting the thermometer, don't move. I wasn't going to move, Dad. That was a figure of speech. I know what a figure of speech is. Even sick, his kid corrected him. Ryan felt the knot in his chest loosen slightly because a child arguing with you still had energy, and energy was a good sign. The thermometer read 101.8. Not dangerous, but real. A proper fever, the kind that needed monitoring and fluids, and the kind of patient presence that Ryan had developed over 8 years from someone who had no idea what he was doing into someone who could manage a sick child alone at 2 in the morning with something approaching competence. He got Mason's water bottle, the blue one with the Triceratops on it, because the other ones were unacceptable for reasons Mason had explained at length and Ryan had mostly retained. He got the children's fever reducer from the bathroom cabinet, which was 3/4 full because he kept it stocked the way a sailor kept a life jacket. Hopefully unnecessary, but you wanted it exactly where you knew it was. He sat on the edge of the bed while Mason swallowed it, making the face all children made at medicine regardless of the flavor. It tastes like fake grapes, Mason said. It is fake grapes. Why can't it taste like real grapes? That's a question for the pharmaceutical industry. Mason looked at him. What's pharmaceutical? Medicine stuff. Making medicine. Oh. He settled back into the pillow. His eyes were already getting heavy from the warmth of the room and the weight of the fever, the way fevers had a sedating quality after the initial misery peaked. Are you going to stay? Yeah, I'm going to stay right here. You don't have to sit on the floor. I'm sitting on your bed. Oh. A pause. Dad? Yeah. Did your dinner go okay? Ryan looked at his son's face. 8 years old, genuinely sick, and still asking about his father's evening. It was the kind of thing Mason did sometimes. Noticed more than he was supposed to, asked about things that a kid his age was theoretically too self-absorbed to remember to ask about. Ryan didn't know where it came from. Maybe it was something that happened to kids who understood early that a parent could be lost. It was fine, Ryan said. Don't worry about that. Dana said you were going on a date. Dana talks a lot. She's your friend. Dana is a force of nature and should probably not be giving status updates to children. He reached over and pushed the damp hair off Mason's forehead. Go to sleep. Mason's eyes closed. His breathing slowed after a few minutes into the particular rhythm of medicated sleep. Deeper and more regular, the body doing what it needed to do. Ryan stayed where he was on the edge of the mattress, back curved, elbows on his knees, watching the orange light of the T-Rex nightlight cast soft shapes on the ceiling. His phone was on the nightstand. He hadn't looked at it since he'd gotten home. He looked at it now and found, to his considerable surprise, that there were 2 more messages from Ava Sterling's number, both sent after midnight. The first one, I'm still awake. Hope the rest of your evening was better than the middle part. The second, sent about 40 minutes later. Sorry, that was probably strange. You don't have to respond. Ryan stared at those 2 messages for longer than was strictly necessary. There was something about the second one, the self-correction, the almost apology, the social backpedaling from someone who never publicly backpedaled from anything, that was more revealing than anything she'd said in the cafe. It was the message of someone who had taken a small risk and then sat alone reconsidering it. He typed back, You're fine. Mason's sick, up with a fever, 101.8. He didn't know why he told her that. It wasn't information she needed. It just came out, the way things came out at 2 in the morning when your defenses were running on fumes. He set the phone down, stood up slowly, stretching the ache out of his lower back, got Mason's spare blanket from the closet, pulled the desk chair over to the side of the bed, the way he always did when Mason was sick, because the chair was more upright than the floor, and his back wasn't 30 years old anymore. It was 32, which wasn't old but was old enough to feel the difference by morning. His phone lit up. How high is too high? Ava had written. For a fever. With a kid. Ryan looked at the message. Then he typed, Over 104, you go to the ER immediately. 103 and not responding to medication, same thing. Below that, you manage it at home. Fluids, rest, reduce the fever, watch it. A short pause. Then, are you watching it? That's what I'm doing right now, yeah. Another pause, longer this time. He thought she'd let it go. Then his phone lit up again. I'll let you be. Text me if it goes up. He started to type something dismissive, a polite thanks, good night that would tidy things up and put them back in their appropriate categories. But his fingers stopped. Instead, he typed, Why would you want to know that? The 3 dots appeared. Took a while. Because I'd want to know, she wrote finally. Get some sleep if you can. Ryan set the phone face down on the desk. Mason shifted in his sleep, made a small, dissatisfied sound, and pulled the blanket up over his shoulder with the instinctive, unconscious efficiency of a child who had been doing this since before he could talk. Ryan watched him settle back into stillness, and sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about how wildly improbable the last several hours of his life had been. He took the temperature again at 4. It had dropped to 100.4. He texted Ava at 4:17, mostly because she'd said to, and because he was awake anyway, and the night was long, and it seemed, in that particular exhausted pre-dawn haze, like a reasonable thing to do. Down to 100.4, heading in the right direction. Her response came in less than 2 minutes, which meant she was awake. Good. Then, you should sleep, so should you. I'm a bad sleeper. Since when? A pause. Since a while. He wanted to ask more. He let it go. Settled back in the chair and watched his son breathe and let the night do what nights did. Move slowly, and then all at once give way to the beginning of something else. By 6:30, Mason's temperature was 99.7 and dropping. He woke up hungry, which was always the sign that the worst had passed. Mason only lost his appetite entirely when he was genuinely miserable, and the return of it was as reliable an indicator of recovery as any thermometer reading. "Can I have toast?" he asked, voice still rough, but clearer than the night before. "You can have toast." "With the dinosaur butter?" The dinosaur butter was a brand of herb butter from the farmer's market that had, through some combination of logo design and Mason's associations, become exclusively referred to as dinosaur butter in their household. Ryan had bought it once to see if Mason would eat it on toast, and the experiment had been so successful that it was now a permanent fixture of the refrigerator door. "Yeah," Ryan said, "I'll make toast." He stood up from the chair, felt his back register 20 complaints, and went to the kitchen. While the bread toasted, he checked his phone again. There was one more message from Ava, sent around 5 in the morning. "I made tea and ended up reading through the Q3 backup redundancy patch notes you flagged. You were right that it needed separate attention. Good catch." Ryan stood in his kitchen in yesterday's clothes with his son's fever breaking in the next room and read a message from a billionaire about server redundancy notes she'd been reading at 5 in the morning and laughed. A short, quiet thing, so he wouldn't wake Mason. Because it was either laugh or feel, something larger and more complicated than the kitchen could currently hold. He typed back, "I'm making toast," she responded. "Dinosaur butter?" He stared at the message. "How do you know about the dinosaur butter?" "You mentioned it once in a meeting, about 2 years ago. You said Mason wouldn't eat anything that didn't have a picture of a dinosaur on it, and someone had started buying dinosaur-shaped products just to get him to eat. I assumed that included condiments." Ryan read that twice. He had no memory of mentioning dinosaur butter in a meeting. He probably had. It was the kind of thing that slipped out sometimes when he was tired, personal details surfacing in professional contexts like debris from a wreck, and he'd always hated it. But she'd remembered it, 2 years later, filed it away. He didn't know what to do with that. So he put the toast on a plate, spread the dinosaur butter thicker than was probably reasonable, and brought it to his son. Mason was sitting up in bed, looking better in the way sick children looked better. Still pale, still tired around the eyes, but alert enough to have rearranged his blankets into a nest configuration and located the library book Ryan had set on the nightstand the night before. "You look better," Ryan said. "My head still hurts a little." "It'll do that for a while. Toast will help." He set the plate on the nightstand. "And then you're staying in bed." Mason looked at him with an expression that was a fairly precise replica of the expression Ryan himself made when someone told him something he didn't want to hear but couldn't reasonably argue with. It was a look Ryan recognized as his own and found mildly unnerving every time it appeared on his son's face. "Can I watch the documentary?" Mason asked. "The one about the mosasaurs?" "How do you know about the mosasaur documentary?" "Mrs. Paulson found it." Ryan made a mental note to give Mrs. Paulson a raise, or at minimum to buy her something nice. "Yeah, you can watch the mosasaur documentary." He got Mason set up with his tablet, then stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a moment. His son, recovering from a fever at barely past 7 in the morning, pulling his library book onto his lap alongside the toast, already reading the back of the book while also waiting for the documentary to load, dividing his attention between things with the cheerful, fractured focus of a child who had never once in his life been bored. Ryan went back to the kitchen, sat down heavily in one of the chairs, and let himself be tired for about 4 minutes. Then he made coffee. While it brewed, he sat at the kitchen table with his phone and did something he hadn't fully decided to do until he was already doing it. He opened the thread with Ava's number and typed, "He's better this morning. Fever's almost gone. He's demanding dinosaur documentaries, which I'm choosing to interpret as a good sign." The response came while he was pouring his coffee. "That's a relief. How are you holding up?" "Fine. Tired. You know how it is." "I actually don't," she wrote. "Not from experience, but I can imagine." He sat down with his mug. Outside the kitchen window, the city was doing what it did at 7 on a Wednesday morning, beginning itself, loud and unasked for. A garbage truck somewhere on the block. The particular pitch of city traffic starting to build. The smell of someone else's coffee from the apartment above. "Can I ask you something?" he typed. "Yes. Last night, in the cafe, you said you didn't feel like being alone. Was that just something you said? Or did you mean it?" The typing indicator appeared. stopped, appeared again. He watched it do that 3 times. I meant it, she finally wrote. I don't usually say things I don't mean. You know that. I know. That's why I'm asking. Why does it matter? He thought about how to answer that. He was too tired for games. His back hurt from the desk chair. His son was watching a documentary about prehistoric marine reptiles 20 feet away. The coffee was strong enough to do something useful. Because I want to know if last night was a one-time thing, or if you're going to keep texting me about server redundancy at 5 in the morning, he typed. A longer pause this time. Is there a preference? He looked at the table. At the cereal bowl Mason had left from yesterday morning, which he'd washed and left to dry on the rack and hadn't put away yet. At the crayon drawing under his coffee mug, a Tyrannosaurus Rex in purple crayon with disproportionately small arms, which was either very accurate or very artistic depending on your perspective. Yeah, he wrote. There is. Then probably not a one-time thing, Ava wrote back. He drank his coffee. Outside, the garbage truck moved on. Mason called from his bedroom that the mosasaurs were enormous, which Ryan confirmed was true, having been informed of this fact approximately 30 times already over the previous weeks. His back ached. The crayon drawing of the tyrannosaur looked up at him from under the mug with tiny, anatomically suspect arms. He was 32 years old. He had not arrived at this Wednesday morning through any route he would have predicted or planned. His life was complicated and exhausting and structurally strange, built from the framework of a loss he still carried in ways he'd stopped trying to name, and the love of a child who asked about pharmaceutical industry flavor choices at 2 in the morning. But something had shifted, sometime between the 58th floor and this kitchen table, and he was too old to pretend not to feel it. He put the phone down, finished his coffee, washed the cereal bowl and put it away this time. Then he went to sit with his son and watch the mosasaurs. Because Mason was sick and needed company, and because some mornings the only thing to do was be exactly where you were. The thing about Ava Sterling was that she texted again at 9:30. Not about server redundancy this time. What does Mason like to eat when he's getting better? Not the sick food, the transition food. What does he want when he's almost okay but not quite? Ryan stared at the message for a moment, genuinely unsure what to do with the fact that she differentiated between sick food and transition food without him explaining what that meant, because she'd apparently just intuited it or thought about it hard enough to get there on her own. Why? He typed. Because I'm in Midtown and there's a deli 3 blocks from your building and I thought I'd get a few things. If that's all right. He sat very still. It was all right. That was the thing. It was entirely, unexpectedly all right, and the fact that it was made him aware of how long he'd been operating under the assumption that nothing like this would be all right again, that the version of his life where someone just showed up with food from a deli because they wanted to was a chapter that had closed. He likes egg salad, Ryan typed, and anything with cheese, and the apple juice boxes, not the fruit punch ones. Got it, she wrote back. I'll be there in 40 minutes. He put the phone down on the table and sat with that for a moment. Then he did 3 things. He told Mason someone was coming over, which produced an immediate interrogation. He deflected with the information that she was someone from work. He changed out of yesterday's clothes for the first time since the previous morning, and he cleaned the kitchen counter, which had accumulated enough evidence of single-parent domestic entropy, unopened mail, a permission slip he needed to sign, 2 expired coupons, a small toy velociraptor, and someone's lost crayon, that it seemed worth addressing before company arrived. He was standing in the living room when the buzzer sounded. He pressed the intercom. Yeah? It's me. Her voice, slightly distorted through the old speaker system, sounded the same as it did in boardrooms, which he found somehow reassuring. I got the egg salad. The guy at the deli also strongly recommended something called a pickle spear, and I have no idea if that's appropriate, but he was very insistent. It's appropriate, Ryan said. Come up. He buzzed her in, stood in the hallway, heard the elevator, old, slow, the kind that announced its arrival with a mechanical sigh. And then the doors opened, and there was Ava Sterling standing in the hallway of his building with a paper bag from a deli, wearing a coat he recognized from a meeting last month, and holding 3 apple juice boxes like she'd had to think about the appropriate number and landed on 3. She looked slightly uncertain. Which was, He'd seen a lot of Ava Sterling's expressions over 3 years, but uncertain was not among his collection. "Hi," she said. "Hi. I may be overbought." She lifted the bag slightly. "Mason will solve that problem." She stepped off the elevator and looked around the hallway. Not critically, just looking, the way she looked at things she was encountering for the first time and wanted to actually see. "How's he doing?" "Better. He's been lecturing me about mosasaurs for the past hour. He's ready for egg salad." "Okay." She followed him to the door, waited while he unlocked it, stepped inside. And here was the thing Ryan hadn't quite prepared for. The particular quality of having a person in your home who had only ever existed in other contexts. His apartment was not the 58th floor. It was 3 rooms, a galley kitchen, dinosaur-themed everything, a permission slip on the counter that still wasn't signed, bookshelves that were 3/4 Mason's books and 1/4 Ryan's in a ratio that accurately represented how their household worked. It was the real version of his life, without architecture or altitude to soften it. Ava looked around at all of it, the ceiling poster of the Cretaceous period, the child-sized coat rack by the door where Mason's jacket hung at a 45-degree angle because he'd never once hung anything straight, the framed photo on the bookshelf, Ryan and Mason at the beach 2 summers ago, Mason holding a horseshoe crab and looking equal parts terrified and delighted. She looked at it for a moment. "That's him?" she said. "Yeah. He looks like you." "He's better looking." She smiled at that. A real one, small and genuine, not the almost smiles she'd been giving him for 3 years in boardrooms and hallways. "Dad?" Mason's voice from the bedroom. "In a second," Ryan called back. He took the bag from Ava's hands, set it on the counter, and looked at her. "You don't have to stay if this is—" "I'd like to stay," she said, "if that's all right." A beat. "And before you answer, I want you to know I'm aware this is a lot. Me being here. I know it's fast and it's strange and I'm your employer and there are approximately 15 reasons this is complicated." She paused. "I still want to stay." Ryan considered her for a moment. Standing in his kitchen in her work coat, holding nothing now that he'd taken the bag, looking at him with the directness she always had, and something underneath it that was less managed than anything he'd seen from her before. "Okay," he said. "Okay?" "Yeah." He pulled the juice boxes out of the bag. "Come meet my kid." Mason, when Ryan appeared in the doorway, was sitting up straighter than he had all morning. Kids had a sixth sense for visitors, a sudden reserve of presentable energy that materialized specifically for audiences. He had clearly attempted to straighten his hair at some point, with limited success. He looked past Ryan at Ava with the frank, unfiltered assessment that only children and very secure adults could pull off. "You're from Dad's work?" he said. "I am," Ava said. She didn't talk to him like a small adult or a baby. She just talked to him the way she'd have talked to anyone, direct and without performance. "I heard you were sick." "I had a fever." 101.8, Mason said, with the authority of someone quoting a personal record. "Dad was up all night." "I know. He texted me updates." Mason looked at Ryan with sudden, bright interest. Ryan made the face that meant "we will discuss this later" and handed Mason the apple juice box. "Egg salad?" "Yes, please." Mason was still looking at Ava with that unnerving child assessment gaze. "What's your name?" "Ava." "I'm Mason." "I know." "How do you know?" "Your dad talks about you sometimes. At work." She paused. "I heard about the dinosaur butter." Mason's eyes went wide with the delight of someone discovering an unexpected audience for their niche interests. "Did he tell you about the ceiling poster?" "He did not." Mason pointed upward. Ava looked at the Cretaceous period poster on the ceiling above the bed, studied it for a moment with apparent sincerity. "That's comprehensive," she said. "It goes from 66 to 145 million years ago," Mason said. "I can find all the eras." "Show me," Ava said. Ryan stood in the doorway of his son's bedroom, holding a container of egg salad and 3 apple juice boxes, and watched Ava Sterling sit on the edge of Mason's bed while his son pointed out geological eras on a ceiling poster explaining with genuine passion the difference between early and late Cretaceous fauna, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness, exactly. Happiness was too clean a word for it. It was more complicated than that, and less certain, and a little bit afraid of itself. But it was real. That was the thing. It was genuinely, unmistakably real. He went to the kitchen and made egg salad sandwiches, and from the bedroom he could hear Mason explaining why the Mosasaur documentary had gotten one particular fact wrong. And he could hear Ava asking follow-up questions, actual questions, not the performative ones adults use to humor children, but the real kind, the kind that meant she was actually listening. He stood at the counter and let that sound fill the apartment for a while. Then he brought in the food, and the three of them sat together in the small room with the dinosaur nightlight still on, even in daylight, and the Cretaceous ceiling overhead, and the morning moved slowly into afternoon the way Wednesday mornings did, without ceremony and without announcement. And the careful, self-contained life Ryan Foster had built so methodically over 4 years, the life held together by routine and discipline and the love of one small person, shifted a little on its foundation, not breaking, not collapsing, just making room. The way it does sometimes when something you'd stopped believing in turns out to be not entirely done with you yet. Ava stayed until 2 in the afternoon, not because she'd planned to. Ryan could tell that she had the slightly restless energy of someone who normally scheduled her Wednesdays down to the half hour and was now experiencing the unfamiliar sensation of a day that wasn't accountable to anything. She kept her phone in her coat pocket and didn't check it once, which Ryan suspected required more active discipline than it appeared. Mason fell asleep after lunch, the recovery sleep that sick kids dropped into without warning, mid-sentence sometimes, the body just filing a unilateral decision. And the apartment went quiet in that particular way it did when a child was asleep, a quality of stillness that was different from regular quiet because it was contingent, temporary, held in place by someone else's breathing. Ryan washed the dishes from lunch. Ava sat at the kitchen table without being asked to and without offering to help, which he appreciated because he'd long ago developed a specific rhythm for doing dishes, and people trying to assist invariably disrupted it. She just sat with her coffee, which he'd made without asking if she wanted it, and which she'd accepted without comment, and looked out the kitchen window at the slice of city visible between the buildings across the street. "You can go," Ryan said. "If you have things." "I always have things," she said. "That's not the same as needing to go." He put a plate in the drying rack. Outside, a siren went past. Doppler shifted into the distance. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said. "You've been asking me personal things since Tuesday night." "This is more personal." She turned from the window. "Then ask." He turned off the water and dried his hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle, turned around and leaned against the counter. The kitchen was not large. They were maybe 5 feet apart, which felt like a relevant detail. "What happened to you?" he said. "Before. You said at the cafe. You said you'd lost someone. You didn't explain further." Ava looked at him. The directness didn't waver, but something shifted behind it, some internal rearrangement. She picked up her coffee mug, didn't drink from it, set it back down. "His name was Daniel," she said. "We were together for almost 3 years. We were going to get married." She paused. "He died in a car accident 5 years ago. I was 25. Ryan said nothing. He'd learned that with grief, other people's specifically, that silence was usually more honest than the reflexive sounds of condolence. That "I'm sorry" was a real thing, but that it also became a kind of punctuation when said too quickly, a mark you put on something to signal you could move past it. "I know what people say," Ava continued, "that time helps. That you figure out how to carry it differently." She turned the mug a quarter rotation on the table. "What they don't tell you is that the figuring out takes so long that by the time you've done it, you've built an entire life around the shape of the absence. And the life works. It functions. But it's built around a hole." "Yeah," Ryan said. "It is." She looked at him. "Sarah." Not a question. She knew his wife's name, probably from company records, probably from the kind of incidental information that passed through an HR department when someone joined as a single father because his wife had died. "Sarah," he confirmed. 4 years ago. Aneurysm. She was 28. He said it the way he'd learned to say it. Directly. without the apologetic softening that had characterized the first year, when saying it felt like asking someone to absorb something he didn't want to hand them. Mason was 4. He remembers her, but barely. He knows her from photos and from things I tell him. What do you tell him? That she was funny, that she could fix anything. Not metaphorically, actually fix things. She was mechanical in a way I'm completely not. She once rebuilt a carburetor in our driveway on a Saturday afternoon, while also helping Mason with a puzzle. He paused. That she would have thought dinosaur butter was the best thing she'd ever heard. Ava was quiet. There was something in her expression, not pity, which he'd have noticed and resented. Something that recognized the specific weight of what he'd described. "How did you keep going?" she asked. It came out genuine, without the clinical quality the question sometimes had from people who were asking because they thought they were supposed to. "I had a 4-year-old who needed to eat breakfast," Ryan said simply. "There's no version of that where you get to stop." She thought about that. "I didn't have that," she said. "After Daniel, there was nothing that specifically needed me in the morning, so She stopped. "I built things instead. Sterling Technologies was 6 people in a shared office space when Daniel died. I made it what it is because I needed somewhere to put everything." She looked around the kitchen, the dinosaur magnets on the fridge, the crayon drawing still on the counter, the purple tyrannosaur Ryan kept meaning to move and kept leaving. "Sometimes I wonder which of us got the better version of surviving." "I'm not sure surviving has better or worse versions," Ryan said. "I think it just has different shapes." "That's a careful answer. It's the honest one." She looked at him. "You don't talk like someone in software infrastructure. You don't talk like someone who owns 4 buildings." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite the laugh from the cafe, but something in the same neighborhood. She looked back out the window, and Ryan let the silence run because it was comfortable now, in a way it hadn't been at the start of the morning. The specific comfort of 2 people who've discovered they're carrying similar weight and have stopped pretending otherwise. "Can I tell you what I actually meant last night?" she said. The question. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She turned back. "You've been at Sterling for 3 years. I've watched you. Not in a strange way. I mean, I've been aware of you in meetings, the way you handle problems, the way you talk about Mason, the way you're always the person in the room who says the thing that's true, even when it's inconvenient." She was choosing her words with the same precision she used in board meetings, but there was nothing strategic about it right now. It was just care. "And I've been watching for 3 years and telling myself it was professional awareness, because the alternative was..." She exhaled. "The alternative was admitting that I'd actually felt something that wasn't professional, and that meant I'd have to do something about it or not do something about it, and both of those choices were terrifying for different reasons." Ryan stayed where he was against the counter. "And then you mentioned a date," she continued, "and something just came out. 4 words. I'd like to say it was calculated, but it wasn't. It was the least calculated thing I've done in years, which is probably why I spent the next 6 hours simultaneously hoping you'd text back and hoping you wouldn't. Which did you land on?" "I was still deciding when you told me about Mason's fever." She looked at him with a directness that was different from her professional version, less armored. "And then I wasn't deciding anymore. I just wanted to know he was okay." Ryan looked at her for a long moment. The October light through the kitchen window was the low, clear kind that happened in the middle of the day before autumn fully committed to being autumn, and it came across the table at an angle that made everything look slightly more real than it normally did, or slightly less defended. The same thing, maybe. "I need to say something," he said. "Okay? I'm not in a place where I can be casual about this." He kept his voice even. "I've tried that. The casual version, where you date someone and it's fine and then it's over and you're back where you started. I don't have the bandwidth for it. I have Mason and I have a job and I have a life that runs on a very specific kind of structure." He paused. "What I'm saying is, if this is something, I need it to actually be something. Not because I'm demanding anything from you right now, but because you deserve to know what you're walking into before you decide whether you're walking into it." Ava looked at him steadily. She didn't rush to respond, which he respected. "I understand that," she said. And there are other things, he said. People at Sterling will notice. They'll talk. It'll be uncomfortable in ways that are hard to predict. I know. And Mason, he stopped. This was the part he always felt most carefully. He's 8. He doesn't need another person who appears and then disappears. So if this becomes, he chose the word deliberately, real, then it needs to be built like something real. Not fast, not convenient, built. Ava was quiet for a moment. I'm 30 years old, she said. I've been running a company since I was 24, and I've been alone since I was 25. I don't do things casually. I don't know how. She looked at him. What I'm saying is, I'm not here because it's convenient. I brought your sick kid apple juice at 9:30 in the morning on a Wednesday. That's not casual. Ryan thought about that. About the 3 apple juice boxes. About her standing in the hallway with the deli bag looking slightly uncertain in a way he'd never once seen on the 58th floor. No, he said, it's not. So, she said. So, he said. Neither of them moved. The kitchen was very still. From down the hall, Mason made the small shifting sound of someone adjusting in their sleep, and both of them turned toward it instinctively, the same instinct at the same moment, and then looked back at each other. And something in that shared reflex, that simultaneous orientation toward the sound of a sleeping child, made the air in the kitchen change. I should let you get back to him, Ava said. He's asleep. I know, but she stood, and there was something careful in the way she did it, the body language of someone navigating something unfamiliar and trying to do it without breaking anything. I don't want to push. Ava. She stopped. You brought egg salad and 3 apple juice boxes, and you spent 45 minutes listening to an 8-year-old explain the Cretaceous period. He looked at her. You're not pushing. Something moved through her expression. Not the smooth professional composure, not the guarded almost smile. Something that was just her, underneath all the architecture she'd spent years building. Okay, she said quietly. She sat back down. They stayed at the kitchen table for another hour, not talking the whole time, sometimes just sitting, which was its own kind of conversation. Ryan made more coffee. At one point, Ava, apparently tired of looking at the crayon tyrannosaur on the counter, picked it up and examined it with what appeared to be genuine interest. The arms are anatomically accurate, she said. I know. He's very proud of that. He should be. She set it back down. The proportions are harder than they look. Ryan looked at her. How do you know that? She shrugged, with the slight self-consciousness of someone revealing something minor that feels more revealing than it is. I used to draw when I was younger. I studied fine arts for a year before I switched to business. He stared at her. Fine arts. It was a long time ago. That is the least expected thing you've ever said to me. I contain multitudes, she said dryly. Apparently. He looked at the tyrannosaur drawing. Mason would lose his mind if you told him that. I'll keep it in reserve. She almost smiled. Strategic information. He laughed. An actual, unguarded laugh, the kind that didn't have time to be managed. And it sat in the kitchen between them and felt like something being set down after a long carry. She looked slightly startled by it, then something in her face relaxed, like a tension resolving. You don't do that enough, she said. Laugh? At work. You're good at your job and you're respected and you're very composed, but you don't... She paused, seeming to search for the exact word. You don't seem like yourself. Most people don't seem like themselves at work. Some people do. You don't. She looked at him. You seem more like yourself here. He thought about that. Yeah, he said. I probably do. Mason woke up at 2:15 with dramatically improved energy and the immediate announcement that he was ready for the second Mosasaur documentary, if there was one. Ryan checked, confirmed there was one, and was in the process of setting it up when his son appeared in the kitchen doorway and found Ava still at the table. Mason looked at her, then at Ryan, back at Ava. You're still here, he said, not accusatory, just noting it. I am, Ava said. I hope that's okay. Yeah. Mason came fully into the kitchen, apparently satisfied. He opened the refrigerator and stared into it with the focused blankness of someone who had forgotten what they were looking for. "Did you eat all the egg salad?" "There's some left," Ryan said. "Okay." Mason retrieved an apple, the green kind, which were the only acceptable kind, and turned around. He looked at Ava again. "Can you stay for the Mosasaur documentary?" Ryan looked at his son. Mason looked back at him with the uncomplicated openness of a child who had not yet developed the self-protective instinct to conceal what he wanted. Ava looked at Ryan. He gave the smallest nod. "Yeah," she said. "I can stay for the Mosasaur documentary." They watched it in the living room, Mason cross-legged on the couch between them with his apple, offering periodic corrections to the narrator's assertions about late Cretaceous ocean ecology in a manner that suggested he found the production team's research slightly insufficient but was willing to overlook it for the sake of the footage. Ava asked questions during the parts where Mason clearly had opinions, which produced a level of animated, detailed explanation that Ryan usually only got when his son was discussing something he'd been thinking about for weeks. It was, objectively, a Wednesday afternoon watching a nature documentary with a sick kid and a woman who owned 4 buildings and had studied fine arts for a year. It was not anything Ryan would have predicted for this particular Wednesday when he'd woken up 40 hours ago. It was also, he thought, sitting on the other end of the couch, with his coffee going cold and his back finally unclenching from 24 hours of bad chairs and worse posture, one of the more quietly good hours he'd had in recent memory. By 4 o'clock, Ava genuinely had to leave. She had a conference call with a European partner at 5, and Denise had apparently sent 3 messages that Ava checked in rapid sequence while putting on her coat, the professional machinery reasserting itself in real time. "Duty calls," Mason said sagely. He'd picked that phrase up from Ryan and deployed it with regularity. "It does," Ava said. She looked at him with the same directness she gave everyone, uncondescending, genuine. "Thank you for teaching me about mosasaurs." "You're welcome." Mason was already turning back toward the television. "Come back sometime. There's a whole documentary about pterosaurs." "Mason," Ryan said. "What?" "There is." "She knows there is." "I'd like to see the pterosaur one," Ava said, which produced a look of great satisfaction from Mason and a particular internal sensation in Ryan's chest that he filed away to examine later. He walked her to the door. They stood in the narrow hallway, coats on respective hooks, the small geography of an apartment exit, which was in some ways the most intimate architecture of daily life. The threshold, the leaving, the specific moment before someone is gone. "Thank you for coming," Ryan said. "Thank you for letting me." She picked up her bag from the hook by the door, hesitated. "I should tell you something before this goes further." "Okay." I'm not easy," she said. "I know that's an understatement. I work too much. I'm bad at sleeping. I have opinions about things that other people find exhausting. I've been told—" She stopped, adjusted. "I've been told by people who meant well that I'm better in a boardroom than in a relationship." She held his gaze. "I don't know if that's true. I haven't let myself find out in a long time. But you should know I'm not going to be a simple addition to your life." Ryan looked at her. She was saying it plainly, without apology, the way she said everything. "Here is the information. Do with it what you will." "My life already has a ceiling poster of the Cretaceous period in it," he said. "I'm not looking for simple." Something shifted in her face. The smallest possible thing, but real. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She opened the door, then stopped. "For the record," she said, not turning around, "I've been afraid of this for a long time. The wanting it. In case you were wondering if last night was impulsive. I was wondering. It wasn't." She turned then, looked at him the way she'd looked at the city from her window, with the patience of someone who'd been waiting for something and had finally stopped pretending they weren't. "It was just the first time I stopped being careful about it." She left. Ryan stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then he closed the door and went back to the living room, where Mason had found the pterosaur documentary without being asked, and had arranged himself and his blanket in the exact same configuration as before, leaving, Ryan noticed, the same space on the couch where Ava had been sitting. He sat down in his own spot. "She's nice," Mason said, eyes on the screen. Yeah, she is. Is she going to come back? Ryan looked at the television. The narrator was explaining the wingspan of the Quetzalcoatlus, which Mason had already told Ava was bigger than most modern planes, a fact she'd received with the appropriate level of horror. I think so, he said. Good. Mason pulled the blanket tighter. She asked good questions. And that was the review. Simple, unambiguous, delivered by the harshest critic Ryan knew. She asked good questions. In Mason's taxonomy of people, that was a very high ranking. The pterosaur documentary ran for 52 minutes. Ryan watched most of it without retaining much because his mind kept circling back to the conversation in the kitchen, not the confession of feelings, though that was part of it, but the other thing. The thing about Daniel, the thing about being 25 and losing someone and building an empire around the absence. He thought about what she'd said. Which of us got the better version of surviving? As if survival was something you could rank or compare, as if grief had a scoring system. He understood why she'd asked it that way. When you'd been alone long enough, you started looking at other people's loss for evidence about whether you'd handled yours correctly, because there was no other reference point. He'd done it himself. Still did, sometimes. The difference was that he'd had Mason to measure himself against. This stubborn, specific, living proof that you could keep going and have it mean something. He'd had a reason that was concrete and demanding and present every morning at 6:30, asking about breakfast. Ava had had an empty office and a company to build. Different shapes, he'd said. He believed that. He also believed that some shapes were harder to inhabit than others, and that the shape of someone who had survived alone, who had built something magnificent and functionally sealed off from anything that could hurt her again, that shape cost something. Left marks. And the fact that she'd shown him some of those marks today, in his kitchen over cold coffee, felt like a thing worth taking seriously. He was still thinking about it when Mason fell asleep again. The second recovery sleep, briefer and lighter than the first, the body making its final accounting for the night's fever. Ryan sat in the quiet living room with the television off and thought about Ava Sterling saying, "I've been afraid of this for a long time." Afraid. She had used that word, specifically, without softening it into something more manageable. He respected that, more than he'd expected to. He picked up his phone, typed. He's already asking about the pterosaur documentary, for what it's worth. The response came in a few minutes. He imagined her on a conference call, phone in her lap under the table, one eye on whatever the Europeans were presenting. Tell him I already looked it up. It's longer than the mosasaur one. Ryan looked at the message, looked at his sleeping son, looked at the space on the couch. He typed back, "You're going to spoil him. Someone probably should." He set the phone down, sat in the quiet. Let the apartment settle around him the way it always did in the early evening. The specific sound of the building adjusting to temperature change, the low urban hum below everything, the orange glow of the T-Rex nightlight starting to be visible now that the daylight was fading from the windows. The thing about grief, Ryan had learned, was that it didn't actually go anywhere. You didn't process it and file it and have done with it. You just eventually got tired of treating it like the most important thing in the room. You started letting other things be equally important, or more. Not because the grief diminished, but because your life quietly expanded around it until the proportions changed. He didn't know what this was, exactly. What was beginning, or whether it would become something that deserved a name. He'd been wrong before about what things would become. He'd also been wrong about what was possible, and that had cost him differently. Not pain exactly, but the kind of low-level resignation that you mistook for realism until something happened to show you the difference. Whatever this was, it had started with a question that shouldn't have been asked, and an honest answer he still hadn't fully given. He thought he might be getting there. He stood up, stretched the remaining protest from his back, and went to start dinner. Mason would wake up hungry. There were things in the refrigerator that could be combined into something reasonable. The permission slip on the counter still needed to be signed. Ordinary things. The structure of a life that had quietly made room for something new, without announcing it, without ceremony, in the middle of a Wednesday that had started as nothing and ended as something he'd think about for a long time. He signed the permission slip. He made dinner. And somewhere across the city, in a 58th floor office with the temperature kept deliberately low, Ava Sterling sat through a conference call about European market expansion and thought about a ceiling poster of the Cretaceous period and a purple crayon tyrannosaur with anatomically accurate arms, and tried to remember the last time an afternoon had felt like time that had actually been used for something real. She couldn't remember. That, she thought, was probably the answer. The week after Mason's fever passed quietly, not uneventfully. Nothing with an 8-year-old was truly uneventful, but quietly, in the sense that nothing dramatic happened and the days moved with the ordinary momentum of a life returning to its usual shape. Mason went back to school Thursday. Ryan went back to the office Friday. The permission slip got turned in 2 days late, which Mason's teacher acknowledged with the weary patience of someone who had learned to pick her battles with single parents. The tyrannosaur drawing migrated from the kitchen counter to the refrigerator door, where it was held in place by a magnet shaped like a brontosaurus. Ryan and Ava texted. That was the thing that was new. The thing that didn't fit neatly into any of the previous categories his life had been organized around. Not professional communication. Those happened separately, through the correct channels with the correct tone, in the same building where they'd always happened. This was the other thing. The thing that started at 2 a.m. and had not, as it turned out, been a temporary condition of exhaustion and unusual circumstance. It wasn't constant. It wasn't the breathless, compulsive back and forth of early infatuation where both people are trying to sustain a frequency that will inevitably drop. It was more irregular than that, more honest. She'd text him something at 11 at night about a problem she was working through, not asking for his input specifically, just thinking out loud in the direction of someone who had demonstrated they could handle her thinking. He'd respond. They'd go back and forth for 20 minutes, and then one of them would sign off because the thing had resolved itself, or because sleep was genuinely necessary. Sometimes it was nothing. A photo she took from her office window of a fog bank sitting on the city at 7 a.m. A response from him. A photo of the dinosaur butter, which had been replaced with a new jar that had a slightly different label, to Mason's intense displeasure and Ryan's quiet amusement. They didn't talk about what it was. Ryan had meant what he said in the kitchen. He didn't do casual and he didn't do undefined, but he also understood that some things needed time before they could be named accurately, and that rushing the naming could damage the thing itself. So they let it be what it was for the moment. Two people who had started paying attention to each other in a new way and were doing so carefully. The Thursday after Mason went back to school, Ryan passed Ava in the hallway on 37. She was coming from a meeting, flanked by 2 people with tablets, moving at the velocity she maintained in professional contexts, which was roughly 15% faster than everyone around her. She caught his eye for exactly 1 second and gave him the briefest possible nod, the kind that was professionally indistinguishable from the acknowledgement she gave any employee she recognized in a hallway. He gave the same back. They were both, he thought, very good at compartments. That evening she texted, "That was strange." He responded, "Yeah. Does it bother you?" The work thing. He thought about it honestly. "Not the way I expected it to." "You?" "I've been thinking about it." A pause. Then, "I've dealt with harder things. That's not really an answer. I know, I'm working on it." He let that be enough for the moment. What bothered Ryan more than the professional awkwardness, which was manageable, a known variable, the kind of complication that came with a clear set of navigation rules, was something less specific, something that surfaced at odd moments, usually late at night, usually when he was sitting in the quiet apartment after Mason was down. The question of whether he was doing this right, whether there was a right. He'd been wrong about Claire, in the sense that he'd gone into that dinner hoping something would be different and had known somewhere in the back of his mind that it wouldn't be. He'd been wrong about the 2 other attempts in the year before Claire, both of which had ended with variations on the same theme. "I think you're great, I just can't do the kid thing." He'd absorbed each one and moved on because moving on was what the situation required, and because Mason needed a father who was functional more than he needed one who was indulging a private grief about romantic disappointment. But Ava was different. He knew that, which meant the stakes were different, which meant being wrong would cost more. He didn't mention any of this to her. Not yet. He sat with it in the way he'd learned to sit with things he wasn't ready to say, keeping them where he could see them, waiting to understand them better before he handed them to someone else. The conversation that changed the calibration of everything happened on a Saturday, 11 days after the Wednesday of the fever. Mason had a birthday party to attend. A classmate named Oliver, who had apparently planned an elaborate dinosaur-themed celebration that Mason had been anticipating with the focused intensity he reserved for things of genuine importance. Ryan dropped him at Oliver's building at 11, confirmed pickup time with Oliver's mother, and was back in his apartment by 11:15, facing the particular disorientation of a Saturday morning with no obligations. He was making lunch he didn't particularly want when his phone rang. Not a text. An actual call, which Ava almost never did. Her preferred mode was text, for the same reason she preferred email to meetings when possible. Written communication gave you more control over your own precision. He answered. "Are you free today?" she said. No preamble. Ava on the phone sounded almost exactly like Ava in person. Direct, slightly clipped, none of the social cushioning most people wrapped around requests. "Mason's at a birthday party until 3. I know, you mentioned it earlier in the week." A short pause. "I want to show you something. Can you meet me at an address I'm going to send you?" He looked at his half-assembled lunch. "How dressed should I be?" "Normally dressed. It's not a restaurant or anything like that." Something in her voice was slightly different, less the executive efficiency she defaulted to, more like the version of her that had sat at his kitchen table and turned a coffee mug between her hands. "It's personal. Give me 20 minutes. The address she sent was in the West Village, a narrower street, older buildings, the part of the city that had managed to preserve something of its original scale against decades of pressure to be larger and more serious. Ryan got there in 15 minutes and stood on the sidewalk in front of a building that didn't look like anything in particular. 4 stories, brick facade, a ground floor space that had been a gallery once based on the faded lettering on the window that now just said available. Ava was already there, leaning against the building with her coat collar up and her hands in her pockets, looking at her phone with the expression of someone who had been waiting slightly longer than they'd expected and had filled the time productively anyway. She looked up when he approached. "Hi," she said. "What is this place?" She looked at the building. Something passed across her face, something complex, several things at once. "It's a building I own," she said. "I bought it 8 years ago. Before Sterling Technologies was what it is now, before I knew what I was going to do with it." She paused. "I still don't entirely know." "Okay." He looked at the ground floor. "What was it?" "An architecture firm used it as studio space for 6 years. They expanded and moved uptown. Before that, it was a printmaking studio. Before that, a photography lab." She reached into her bag and produced a key. "Come inside." The ground floor smelled like the specific combination of old brick and dry air and the faint chemical ghost of whatever materials had lived there for decades. It was empty. Completely, furnitureless empty. The kind of empty that made you aware of the actual volume of a space in a way that furnished rooms didn't. High ceilings. Original wood floors with the honest marks of being original. Scuffs and gaps, and the irregular surface of boards that had been walked on for 90 years. 3 large windows facing the street, south-facing, the kind of light that was flat and clean and even. Ryan stood in the middle of the room and looked around. "This is a good space," he said. "I know." She was standing near the windows. "I've been trying to decide what to do with it for 2 years. Every time I think I've figured it out, it doesn't feel right." She turned from the window. "I had plans drawn up for a tech incubator, then a community office space. Then I was going to let a friend use it for a restaurant, and I changed my mind 3 days before the lease was supposed to be signed." "Why'd you change your mind?" "Because I didn't want it to be a restaurant." She looked at the walls. "I don't know what I want it to be. That's been bothering me more than it should." She paused. "I thought maybe if I showed it to someone else, I'd figure out what I was seeing in it." He looked at her. "Why me?" She held his gaze. "Because you're the person I wanted to show it to." Ryan turned back to the room, walked toward one of the windows, looked out at the street, quiet for a Saturday, a couple walking a dog, an older man in a canvas coat reading something on his phone. Then he turned around and looked at the space from the window's perspective. The full depth of it, the ceiling height, the particular quality of light from the south-facing glass. You studied art, he said, for a year. But you still think about it. It wasn't a question. She was quiet for a moment. I never stopped thinking about it. I just stopped doing anything about it. She looked at her hands briefly. Sterling Technologies was supposed to be a means to an end. I was going to build it and sell it at 30 and then figure out what I actually wanted to do. She stopped. I built it and I didn't sell it, and now it's worth 4 times what I projected, and I have no idea what the end was supposed to be. Ryan looked at her standing in the empty room. She was 30 years old and she owned 4 buildings and a technology company, and she was standing in her own empty space trying to understand why she couldn't let go of it. You held on to it because it still has a question in it, he said. The space. You kept it because you haven't answered the question yet. She looked at him. What question? The one you were asking when you were 24 and buying a building in the West Village on what I assume was not much money. He turned to look at the walls. Whether you were building something or hiding in something. Whether the company was what you wanted or what you needed. Whether the person you were before Daniel was still in there somewhere, or whether that version of you was gone. He paused. You kept the space because you're not ready to answer that yet. And you brought me here because... He stopped. Because, she said, because you wanted to see what it felt like. To let someone in. The room was very quiet. Somewhere outside a car alarm started and stopped. The light through the south windows moved a fraction as a cloud passed. Ava stood still for a moment. Then she sat down on the floor. Simply, without ceremony, just folded herself down onto the wood boards the way she might have at 20, at 15, before everything had become managed and strategic. She sat with her back against the wall under the windows and her knees up and looked at the opposite wall. Ryan sat down next to her. Not close enough to be pointed, just there. I used to paint, she said, specifically. Not a lot of mediums, just paint. Big canvases, messy, the kind of thing you can't do in a small apartment. She looked at the room. I had a studio space in school. I gave it up when I switched to business, and I've never had another one. Because you never needed one. Because Sterling Technologies was enough. Because Sterling Technologies was more than enough. She said it with the particular flatness of a truth that had been worked over a lot. It fills everything. I let it fill everything. That was the point. And now? She turned her head to look at him. And now there's a space I can't fill, and a question I can't answer, and a software engineer who keeps a ceiling poster of the Cretaceous period and whose kid let me watch a documentary about mosasaurs on a Wednesday. She exhaled. And I don't know what to do with any of that. You don't have to do anything with it right now. I know. But you showed me the space, he said. That's something. She looked at the empty room. It's something, she agreed. They sat on the floor of the empty building for a while. It was the kind of conversation that moved in and out of silence without losing its thread. Something Ryan had almost forgotten was possible. The specific ease of being with someone, where silence wasn't an absence to be managed, but just another way the conversation happened. He'd had that with Sarah. He'd assumed, not consciously but structurally, somewhere in the architecture of his expectations, that he wouldn't have it again. He told her that. Not all of it. Not the comparison, which felt too large for the room, but the part about the silence, that he'd forgotten what it felt like. Ava listened without jumping to reassure him, which he appreciated. She just sat with it the way he'd sat with what she'd said about Daniel, giving it the weight it deserved before responding. I haven't had it at all, she said finally. The kind of quiet with another person that isn't just the absence of talking. She looked at her hands. With Daniel, it was... We were very young, 22, 23. We didn't know how to be quiet together yet. We were still in the part where everything is urgent. A pause. I wonder sometimes what it would have been like if we'd had more time to get past that part. You can wonder about that without it being disloyal to what you had, Ryan said. She glanced at him. I spent a lot of time early on feeling like it was wrong to imagine things being different, he said. Like grieving Sarah meant not being allowed to wish things had gone another way, or to think about what we never got to. Someone told me eventually, a therapist, which I want to be clear I was resistant to for about 6 months before I went, That wanting more time isn't the same as being ungrateful for the time, that you can hold both. Did it help, the therapy? Not the way I expected it to. I went in wanting someone to explain how to stop feeling bad, and what I got was someone who made me explain out loud what was actually happening. He paused. Which is harder and more useful. Ava nodded slowly. She was looking at the floor, at the wood grain, tracing something with her thumbnail on the surface beside her. I never went, she said, after Daniel. People suggested it. I was polite about not doing it. A brief pause. I think I was afraid that if I let someone actually look at it, it would be worse than managing it alone. It is worse, Ryan said honestly. Initially. But the managing it alone thing, that has a cost too. It just takes longer to show up on the bill. She looked at him. Something in her expression was different from anything he'd seen from her across 3 years of professional proximity. Not the directness, which was constant, not the composure, but the thing underneath both of those. The part that the office and the altitude and the 58th floor windows were constructed to protect. She was letting him see it without looking away, which was its own kind of courage. You're better at this than I expected, she said. Surviving? Talking about it, being honest about it without it being a performance of honesty. She paused. I know people who talk about their pain with this practiced quality, like they've told the story enough times that it's become something they present rather than something they carry. You don't do that. I told you. Mason doesn't let me get away with things. He looked at the south windows. When you spend enough time with a person who doesn't have filters yet, you start to lose some of yours. Is that good? Mostly. He glanced at her. Sometimes I miss the filters. She almost smiled. Which ones? The one that would have stopped me from caring about this, he said, gesturing loosely at the space between them. Would have been simpler. Simpler isn't the same as better. No, he agreed. It's not. They sat for a while longer. The afternoon light shifted as it tended to in October, the sun moving south in a way that was starting to feel like a warning about the season that was coming. Ryan's phone showed 2:15 when he checked it, still 45 minutes before he needed to leave for Oliver's building to collect Mason. I want to ask you something, Ava said. Yeah. The first time we actually had a conversation, not in a meeting, not a hallway, but actually talked. Do you remember what it was about? He thought back. 3 years was a long corridor to walk down. The system migration, he said. The one that went wrong, 18 months ago, middle of the night. You called me at 2 a.m. The migration had failed and we were going to lose 6 weeks of data, and I needed someone to authorize emergency override, and my direct supervisor wasn't answering. He looked at her. I called you because you'd given your cell to the whole senior team at the all hands and said explicitly to use it if something was actually on fire. And you decided it qualified. It was on fire, figuratively. I picked up, she said. You picked up on the second ring, Ryan said, at 2 a.m, and you asked me 3 questions and told me to go ahead with the override and went back to sleep. I didn't go back to sleep. He looked at her. I stayed up until 4:30, reading through the migration logs you sent me afterward, she said. I sent you a message the next morning about 2 things I wanted changed in the protocol. I remember. I thought you were a machine. I was interested, she said, in how you handled it, the way you communicated the problem. Clear, no panic, just the information that was needed, and a specific ask. She paused. Most people in a crisis give you the feeling and not the facts. You gave me the facts. I was panicking internally. I know. That was actually the other thing I noticed. You were scared, but you were functional, which is... She stopped. Which is rarer than you'd think at that level. Ryan looked at her. He was understanding something, sitting there on the floor of her empty building, that he'd been working toward without knowing it. That Ava Sterling had been paying attention to him for longer than Tuesday night, longer than she'd implied. That the question in the office had not been spontaneous in the way it seemed, that it had been, maybe, the release of something held for a long time, and Tuesday evening had simply been the moment when holding it cost more than letting it go. How long? He said. She knew what he was asking. A while, she said, with the deliberate vagueness of someone who had a more specific answer and was deciding how much of it to give. Long enough that I'd convinced myself it was a category error. You know, the kind of feeling you talk yourself out of by listing the reasons it doesn't make sense. And the list stopped working. The list stopped working, she confirmed. Around the time you mentioned a date, and I asked 4 words I'd apparently been holding for longer than was reasonable. Ryan looked at the wall across the room, then back at her. For what it's worth, he said, I've been not looking at you for 3 years. Not looking. The deliberate kind, the kind that requires effort. He held her gaze. I had a rule. About not... He stopped. Reconsidered. I had a very logical, sensible reason for not letting this happen. What was it? That it was complicated, the work thing, the Mason thing, the fact that wanting things I couldn't have was a habit I'd broken, and I didn't want to start again. He paused. The fact that you were the most capable person I'd ever been in a room with, and that felt like evidence of distance rather than proximity. My capability is distance? It can read that way, when it's all you're allowed to see. She absorbed that, looked at the room. I do that deliberately, she said. I know I do. It started as survival and it became, I don't know, a branding decision I never made but ended up with anyway. She glanced at him. Does it bother you that this is... She gestured at the space around them. That you're seeing the other version. Which version is the other one? This one. The one on the floor. Ava. He waited until she looked at him. The one on the floor is the one I'm here for. She held his gaze. Something moved through her expression. Something that he'd seen once before. In the cafe, when she'd said it was just the first time I stopped being careful about it. It was the look of someone recalibrating around a new piece of information, letting something adjust. Okay, she said. Okay? Neither of them moved for a moment. Then his phone buzzed. He checked it. A text from Oliver's mother. Oliver's having a meltdown over the dinosaur cake. All fine. Just running a few minutes behind on pickup. Can you come at 3:15? He showed it to Ava. She read it. Dinosaur cake crisis, she said. It's always something with the cakes. He started to stand, the floor having delivered the full indictment of being 32. I should get going. She stood too. They were in the middle of the empty room, in the afternoon light, a foot apart, the whole space around them silent and waiting. I want to keep doing this, she said. Whatever this is. Figuring out what this is. She looked at him steadily. I want to keep doing it. Yeah, he said. So do I. Even with the work thing. Even with the work thing. And the part where I'm bad at sleeping and apparently very frightening in meetings. Mason's not afraid of you. Mason is 8 and wanted me to watch a mosasaur documentary, she said. His judgment is exceptional, Ryan said. His judgment is exceptional. He told me you ask good questions. Ava Sterling, $4 billion and 3 years of practiced boardroom composure, looked slightly undone by that. Just briefly. Just enough. He said that? Yeah. Ryan picked up his jacket from where he'd set it on the floor. He has a very specific ranking system for people, and that's near the top. She was quiet for a moment. Not the considering her next move quiet. Just quiet. In the way of someone sitting with something that mattered more than they were prepared for it to. Tell him I've been doing research on pterosaurs, she said finally. That will go over extremely well. I know. Something in her voice when she said it, a warmth, understated and real, the kind that didn't broadcast itself. Go get your kid. He walked toward the door, stopped with his hand on the old frame, turned back. She was still standing in the middle of the empty room. Coat on, bag over her shoulder, standing in the particular quality of light from those south-facing windows that made the space look like something that knew what it was waiting to become. For the record, he said, I think you should paint in here. She looked at him. Not for anyone else. Not for Sterling Technologies, or a foundation, or a strategic investment. He looked at the walls. Just because you used to and you stopped and the space has been waiting and that's reason enough. He didn't wait for her to respond. He went out through the old door into the West Village afternoon, down the quiet street toward the subway, toward Oliver's building and the dinosaur cake crisis, and the ordinary, irreplaceable, demanding life that waited for him on the other end. Behind him, in the empty room, Ava stood in her own space and looked at the walls the way she'd looked at her city from the 58th floor, with the patience of someone who had finally stopped waiting and started deciding. And somewhere in that decision, small and quiet and built from the ground up rather than the sky down, something was beginning. 3 weeks after Ryan walked out of the West Village building and told Ava she should paint in it, she sent him a photo at 11:40 on a Tuesday night. It was a canvas, roughly 2 feet by 3, propped against the brick wall of the ground floor space, lit by what looked like a single work lamp positioned off to the left. The painting was unfinished, clearly, deliberately unfinished, the kind of in-progress work that had paint still wet in some places and bare canvas in others. Abstract in the way that wasn't evasion, but precision, color laid down with the confidence of someone who understood what they were doing and the hesitation of someone who had been away from it for a long time and was finding their way back. Blues and deep ochres and one slash of something almost red near the lower right corner that looked like it hadn't been planned. Underneath the photo, she'd written, "You were right, don't make a thing of it." Ryan sat in his kitchen and looked at the photo for a long time. Then he typed, "It's good," paused, "I mean it." Her response took a few minutes. "I know you mean it, that's why I showed you." He put the phone down and sat with the feeling that produced the specific, slightly off-balance sensation of being trusted by someone who didn't trust easily. It wasn't comfortable exactly. It was the kind of feeling that reminded you that something real was happening, which was different from comfortable. Better, but different. They'd been careful with each other in the weeks since the West Village, not distant. The texts continued, and twice they'd met for coffee in the early morning before the building woke up properly. A cafe near Sterling's North Tower where neither of them was likely to run into anyone, drinking coffee at 7:15 with the city starting up around them like a machine that had never been turned off. They talked about everything: Mason, the paintings, the company, the strange, specific geography of two people who were navigating something new while also still having to see each other in hallways and pretend the hallways were just hallways. It wasn't always graceful. The compartments required maintenance. There was a Tuesday afternoon in a conference room where Ryan was presenting to a cross-departmental group, and Ava came in 40 minutes late, pulled in from something else. He could tell by the residual tension in her posture, and sat at the far end of the table and listened with her arms folded. And he'd had to actively work to not perform for her specifically, to keep the presentation what it needed to be rather than what some stupid part of him wanted it to be. Afterward, she'd messaged him, "Good presentation." And then a minute later, "That was hard." He'd written back, "Yeah, they were figuring it out." That was the honest version. They were two people with complicated lives and a real thing between them and no clear map, and they were making decisions one at a time about how to handle it, and sometimes the decisions were good, and sometimes they were awkward, and that was what it actually looked like when something was real rather than curated. What changed? What shifted the whole thing from careful to something with more weight to it? Started with Mason, because in Ryan's experience, most of the things that mattered started with Mason. It was a Saturday in November, 5 weeks after the fever, 4 weeks after the West Village building. The city had committed fully to autumn by then. The temperature had dropped the way it did in the second half of October, not gradually, but suddenly. One morning you walked outside and it was just cold, and the light had changed from the thin, clear October version to something lower and more amber. Ryan liked November in the city. He'd always liked the way it made everything contract slightly, drew people indoors, gave the streets a purposeful quality that summer's sprawl didn't have. Ava had asked, carefully and without pressure, whether she could come over again. Not framed as a date, she'd been deliberate about that, just as, "I'd like to see Mason if that's okay. And you." That ordering, Ryan suspected, was not accidental. He'd said yes, and then he'd sat with the implications of yes for a day and a half, because inviting Ava Sterling into his apartment on a Wednesday when his kid was sick was one thing. That had happened organically, crisis-adjacent, without the weight of intention. Inviting her on a Saturday was different. That was a choice made in full clarity. That was saying, this is a real thing and here is my real life, and I'm showing you both of them together. She arrived at 11. Mason answered the door before Ryan could get there, which was a thing Mason did. He had the door-answering instincts of a golden retriever, enthusiastic and immediate. He looked at Ava standing in the hallway. She was holding a white bakery box tied with brown string, and she was wearing a coat he hadn't seen before. Dark green, slightly too large, the kind you bought because it was comfortable rather than because it looked right. And her hair was down the way it had been in the office that first evening. "Hi," Mason said. "Hi." She held up the box. "I brought cookies. They're dinosaur-shaped. I had to go to 3 bakeries." Mason's face did the thing it did when something exceeded his expectations. A kind of full-body recalibration, all the casual skepticism of an 8-year-old temporarily suspended. "What kinds are there?" "Stegosaurus, Triceratops, and what the bakery called a Brachiosaurus, but I think the neck is anatomically shorter than it should be." Mason considered this. "They usually get the neck wrong," he said, with the weary authority of someone who had been disappointed by this before. "Come in." He stepped aside. Ava came in. She caught Ryan's eye over Mason's head as she passed through the doorway, and the look she gave him was part amusement and part something else, something that was not quite nerves but was adjacent to nerves, the awareness of the moment she was walking into. Ryan took her coat, a small, ordinary thing. She let him, which felt like its own kind of trust. They opened the bakery box at the kitchen table. Mason examined each cookie with the careful attention of a museum curator verifying provenance, ultimately pronouncing the Triceratops the most accurate and the Brachiosaurus problematic but acceptable. Ava had also, Ryan noticed, gotten 2 plain butter cookies that weren't dinosaur-shaped, which suggested she'd thought about the possibility that not every item needed to be on theme, which in turn suggested she'd been thinking about this more carefully than the casual framing of "I'll bring cookies" implied. He liked that about her. The thinking carefully about small things quality. In a person who operated at the scale she did, that kind of attention to detail and personal context wasn't a given. After the cookie audit, Mason announced that he'd been building something important and that Ava should come see it. The important thing was a city, not a small city, an ambitious one, occupying approximately 40% of Mason's bedroom floor, constructed from the large wooden blocks Ryan had bought 3 birthdays ago, supplemented by a collection of smaller blocks, several cardboard boxes of various sizes that Mason had repurposed from the recycling, and what appeared to be a road system made from brown packing tape applied directly to the hardwood floor. The road system was going to be a problem to remove later. Ryan added it to the mental list. "It's the Cretaceous," Mason said. "But if the animals built cities..." Ava stood in the doorway of the bedroom looking at it. Ryan watched her actually look at it, not the polite, rapid assessment of an adult acknowledging a child's creation before moving on, but genuinely looking, taking in the structure and the intention behind it. "What's this building?" she said, pointing to a tall construction in the center that had a cardboard tube from a paper towel roll as its top section. "The research tower," Mason said. "The velociraptors run it. They're the smartest, so they do the science." "And this area?" She pointed to a section with lower, wider structures. "Feeding district. The big sauropods need a lot, so they live near the food. That's actually good urban planning." Mason looked at her. "I know. I thought about it." Ryan leaned against the door frame and watched his son and this woman crouch down over the Cretaceous city and discuss the structural logic of dinosaur urban development with the mutual seriousness of 2 people who had both independently decided this was worth taking seriously. He thought about what Mason had said 3 weeks ago. She asked good questions. He thought about what it meant that his son, who had been 4 when his mother died, and who had grown up in the architecture of that loss without being fully aware of it, had opened a door before Ryan could get there and examined a bakery box with full critical engagement and was now consulting on the feeding district placement. Kids knew things. Not everything, and not always accurately, but they had instincts that adults had been taught to override. Mason's instincts about people were usually right in the way that uncomplicated instincts often were, not because he was exceptional, but because he hadn't yet learned to talk himself out of what he felt. They built for an hour. This was not Ryan's plan for the morning. He'd imagined something more structured, lunch maybe, something with the scaffolding of an activity that would give them all somewhere to put their attention. Instead, they ended up on the floor of Mason's bedroom, all three of them, adding to the Cretaceous city. Ava turned out to have opinions about load-bearing structure that she delivered without making Mason feel corrected, which was a skill Ryan had taken years to develop, and which she appeared to have somewhat naturally. Mason accepted her structural suggestions with the open evaluation of someone weighing evidence rather than deferring to an adult, and in 2 cases rejected them with reasoning that made Ava visibly reconsider. Ryan built a wall section and didn't say much and watched them. This was the thing no one had warned him about, he thought. Not the falling for someone. That he'd braced for, that he'd understood as a possibility with clearly delineated risks. It was this, the watching. The moment where someone who had entered your life through the door of your own feelings walked into the room where your child lived, and your child just let them in, without being asked, without the careful adult negotiation of permission and reassurance. It was the most terrifying thing that had happened in weeks. And also the best. They had lunch. Ryan made sandwiches, the good ones, not the perfunctory ones. And they ate at the kitchen table where he'd had so many conversations with Ava, now that the kitchen had started to feel like a place that was partly hers, which was a thought he didn't examine too closely because it was too large for a Tuesday, and this was a Saturday, but the sentiment was the same. Mason ate half a sandwich and 2 dinosaur cookies and then asked, with the conversational non sequitur that characterized most of his transitions, "Are you guys dating?" Ryan's sandwich stopped halfway to his mouth. Ava set her water glass down very carefully. Mason looked between them with the clear-eyed, unself-conscious curiosity of someone who had asked a perfectly reasonable question and was waiting for a perfectly reasonable answer. "That's," Ryan started. "It's a fair question," Mason said. "It is a fair question," Ava said, at the same time. They glanced at each other. "You come over," Mason said, addressing Ava with the directness Ryan had apparently passed to him genetically. "And Dad texts you. I've seen him do it. He gets a specific face." "What face?" Ryan said. "The one where you're trying not to have a face," Mason said. "You do it sometimes when you think something is good, but you don't want to make it weird." Ryan put his sandwich down. Ava appeared to be experiencing something in the vicinity of suppressed laughter. She had her mouth pressed together and her eyes were doing something that was going to become a laugh if she let it. Ryan looked at Ava. "We're figuring it out," he said. Which was true. Which was the most honest answer available. "Figuring out if you're dating?" Mason asked. "Figuring out what this is," Ryan said. Mason appeared to consider this with the patience of someone willing to evaluate ambiguous information. Then he looked at Ava. "Do you want to be?" Ava looked at Ryan. Not for rescue. She had never in her life looked to anyone for rescue, and he understood that. But with the particular look of someone checking whether the answer they were about to give was one the other person was ready to hear. Ryan gave her the smallest nod. "Yeah," Ava said to Mason, steady and honest. "I want to be." Mason looked at Ryan. "Do you?" "Yeah," Ryan said. I do." Mason thought about this for a moment. Then he picked up his second dinosaur cookie. "Okay," he said. "The Triceratops cookies are really good." And that was the verdict, issued with the finality of someone who had asked what he needed to ask and received what he needed to receive and was now prepared to move on to more important matters, specifically Triceratops-shaped shortbread. Ryan looked at Ava across the kitchen table. She was looking back at him with an expression he hadn't seen before. Something completely unguarded, soft in a way that had nothing of the boardroom in it and everything of the woman who sat on empty floors and talked about Daniel and kept a space she couldn't let go of because it had a question still living in it. She looked like someone who had, unexpectedly and without a plan, gotten something she'd stopped knowing she wanted. He suspected he looked the same way. Later, after the Cretaceous city had been extended to include a harbor district that Mason had determined the mosasaurs would require after another round of coffee, after Mason had fallen into the focused, solitary absorption of a child who has had enough social interaction and needs quiet time with his blocks, Ryan and Ava sat on the couch while Mason occupied the floor 6 feet away, and talked in low voices about nothing in particular, the way people talked when the conversation was less about the content and more about the fact of it. At some point, her shoulder was against his. Neither of them moved away. That was all. That was the whole thing. A shoulder against a shoulder on a couch, while a child built a prehistoric harbor district on the floor, and the November light came through the window at its low November angle, and the apartment held all of it without asking for an explanation. It was not a perfect afternoon. Mason knocked over a section of the city and had a brief, intense frustration response that Ryan talked him down from with the patient efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 4 years. The coffee got cold again. Ryan spilled some on the couch cushion, and Ava handed him a dish towel without comment, and they both pretended it hadn't happened with the easy conspiracy of people who had already decided minor embarrassments weren't worth cataloging. Real things were like that. Spills and knocked over buildings, and 8-year-olds who asked direct questions at the lunch table. Ryan had spent enough time in the aftermath of loss to know the difference between a life that was good and a life that was just surviving, and the difference was exactly this. The small frictions and the unscheduled moments, and the shoulder against the shoulder while someone small and important rebuilt something that had fallen. When Ava left that evening, later than she'd planned, which had been true of every time she'd been here, as if his apartment had some property that made time move differently. Ryan walked her to the door and they stood in the hallway again, this small repeated geography of departures that had become its own kind of ritual. "Mason's good," she said. "Not he's so great or you've done such an amazing job. Just that. Mason's good." The simplest possible assessment, carrying the specific weight of someone who had been paying attention and was giving you the honest version. "Yeah," Ryan said. "He is." She looked at him. "You did that." "He did most of it himself." "That's not how it works, and you know it." She held his gaze. "You kept everything together for 4 years, and he's curious, and he's kind, and he let a stranger look at his city on the first visit and explained the feeding district like it mattered." She paused. "It matters because you taught him things matter." Ryan didn't have an answer for that. He stood in the hallway and let her say it because she meant it, and it deserved to be received rather than deflected. "What you've built," she said more quietly, "with just the two of you. That's something, Ryan. I want you to know I see that." The hallway was very quiet. "I see what you're building too," he said. "The space, the painting, coming back to something you left a long time ago." He looked at her. "That takes something." She exhaled. "It's one painting. It's a start." "You said that like you know where it ends." "I don't," he said. "But I'd like to find out." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then, in the hallway of his apartment building at 6:30 on a November Saturday, Ava Sterling leaned forward and kissed him. Brief and unhurried and without the performance of a first kiss, without the self-consciousness that first things usually carried. Just real. Just the thing itself. She stepped back. He looked at her. "Okay?" he said, which was not the most eloquent response in the history of such moments, and he was aware of that, and he also couldn't come up with anything better and didn't particularly try. "Okay," she said, and smiled. The real one. The one that arrived without being planned, that he'd first seen over a half-eaten cardamom pastry in a cafe that smelled like cardamom and old wood. She left. He went back inside. Mason was on the couch, the Cretaceous harbor complete, watching the kind of television he watched when he was tired and didn't want anything that required attention. Something with animals, ambient and slow. He looked up when Ryan came back in. "Is she coming back?" he said. "Yeah," Ryan said. "She is." Mason nodded, satisfied, and went back to the television. Ryan sat in the armchair across from his son and let the evening settle. Outside, the city was doing its Saturday evening version of itself. Louder, more urgent, the pitch of people starting their nights. But in here, it was quiet. In the way the apartment was always quiet when it was just the two of them, which was the same quiet it always had been, and was also, now, slightly different. Not the quiet of absence anymore. Not the quiet of a life built precisely around a hole. The hole was still there. He wasn't naive about that. Grief didn't close on a timeline, and Sarah would always be the first chapter of the story he was in. He'd stopped expecting otherwise, but the life had expanded around it in the way he'd told Ava it did, slowly and without announcement, until the proportions were different. He thought about the question that had started all of it. 4 words from a woman standing next to her own desk on a Tuesday evening in October, before she'd decided to be careful about it. He thought about all the careful he'd been doing for 4 years, the responsible, structured careful of a man who understood exactly what he could afford to lose and had arranged his life to minimize the risk. And he thought about Mason's voice at the lunch table. Okay, the Triceratops cookies are really good. The verdict delivered with cookie in hand, unceremonious and absolute. Kids knew. Maybe the real wisdom in all of it was that simple. You built your walls high enough to survive, and you maintained them long enough to know you could. And then at some point a question got asked that you hadn't prepared for, and you made the decision. Not because the walls came down, but because you decided consciously to open a door in them. To let something in that wasn't certainty, wasn't safe, wasn't guaranteed. Because nothing real ever was. The week after that Saturday, 2 things happened that Ryan hadn't planned for. The first, he was called into a meeting with Sterling Technologies' general counsel, a woman named Patricia Holt, who had the energy of someone who had seen every possible workplace complication and was professionally unsurprised by all of them. She sat across from him in a small conference room and explained, with the measured neutrality of someone doing her job, that there were guidelines about relationships between company executives and employees that both parties would want to be aware of, and that she was making him aware of them, and that Ava Sterling had already been made aware of them on her end. Ryan listened, asked 2 questions, got 2 clear answers. So the short version, he said, is that it needs to be disclosed formally, and there can't be any reporting relationship between us, which there currently isn't, and beyond that, it's our business. That's the short version, yes, Patricia Holt said. Okay. There will be people who talk, she said, not as a threat, just information. I know. He stood up. People already talk about everything. She almost smiled. They do. He filled out the disclosure form that afternoon. Ava had already filed hers that morning, he found out later, which meant she'd set the meeting with Patricia before the Saturday, before the hallway. Before any of it had been explicitly named, she'd anticipated it, prepared for it, handled the professional machinery with the same precise efficiency she applied to everything. He texted her. I filed the form. She responded, I know, Patricia told me. How do you feel? He thought about it honestly, like I did something real. You? A pause. Like I finally stopped pretending I wasn't going to. The second thing that happened that week was smaller and larger at the same time. He was in the kitchen on a Wednesday evening, making dinner, Mason at the table doing homework with the particular aggressive pencil pressing of a child working through math he found annoying when his son looked up and said without preamble, Do you think Ava will be around for a long time? Ryan turned from the stove. Why? Mason shrugged with the elaborate casualness of someone who wanted to ask something but didn't want to appear to care too much about the answer. Just wondering. Ryan turned the heat down on the pan, sat down across from his son at the table, because this was the kind of question that deserved his full attention and not the back of his head. I think so, he said. I hope so. It's still new, though, so I can't promise anything. Mason looked at his math worksheet. Mom was around, and then she wasn't, he said. Not accusatory, not sad, exactly, just a fact, stated plainly by someone who had been 4 when it happened and was now 8 and had been thinking about the architecture of impermanence in a child-specific, concrete way. Ryan felt the full weight of it. Let it sit there rather than trying to move it. Yeah, he said. She was. That wasn't your fault, Mason said, still looking at the worksheet. I know that. I just wanted to say it. Mason picked up his pencil. Because sometimes people don't say it. Ryan sat at the kitchen table with his son and felt something shift in his chest. Not break, not crack, just move. The way things moved when they'd been held in one position long enough and the holding finally eased. She would have liked Ava, Mason said, now actually doing the math problem. Mom. She liked people who were honest. Ryan looked at his son. 8 years old, doing math homework, having just said 3 of the most precise things anyone had said to him in recent memory. "Yeah," he said. "She would have." Mason finished the problem. "Can we have the pasta with the cheese sauce?" "Yeah," Ryan said. "We can." He got up and went back to the stove. The pasta water was already boiling. Outside the kitchen window, the city was dark and lit and perpetual, doing what it always did without requiring anything from him specifically. He thought about what his son had just given him. Not permission. He hadn't needed permission. That wasn't what it was. Something harder to name. An acknowledgement. A child who had been 4 when his mother died, looking up from his math homework and saying that wasn't your fault, and she would have liked her because he was 8 and honest and had apparently been thinking about this for longer than Ryan had known. Kids knew. He made the pasta. Mason finished his homework. They ate dinner and argued briefly about whether the Mosasaur documentary had gotten the size estimates right, and Mason won the argument on points, and Ryan conceded because Mason was correct, and also because the particular pleasure of being out-argued by your own child was one of the quietly good things in a life full of quietly good things that he'd learned to notice. After Mason was in bed, Ryan sat at the kitchen table one more time and sent Ava a message. Mason asked if you'd be around for a long time. Her response took a minute. "What did you tell him?" "That I thought so. That I hoped so." He looked at the Tyrannosaur drawing on the refrigerator. "He said his mom would have liked you." A longer pause this time. "That's..." she started. Stopped. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it. I just wanted you to know." Another pause. "Can I come over this weekend?" "Yeah," he wrote. "Bring the dinosaur cookies again." "Mason's already asking." "3 bakeries," she wrote. "It's becoming a whole thing." "Worth it?" The 3 dots appeared. "Took their time." "Yeah," she wrote finally. "It's worth it." Ryan set his phone on the table and sat in the kitchen of his ordinary, complicated, irreplaceable life and felt, all the way through, that it was. There was no single moment when everything became clear. That was the thing about real life. It didn't resolve the way a story was supposed to, with the clean click of a final piece finding its place. It was more gradual than that, more uncertain, more honest. What Ryan understood, sitting in that kitchen in November with the pasta dishes in the drying rack and his son asleep down the hall, and a message from Ava on his phone and the Tyrannosaur drawing held up by a Brontosaurus magnet. What he understood was that the life he'd built after the worst thing had happened was not a temporary life. It was not a holding pattern, a survival structure waiting to be replaced by something better. It was the real thing. It had been the real thing all along, and adding something new to it didn't diminish what it already was. He was 32 years old. He had a job he was good at and a son who out-argued him on paleontology, and 4 years of learning what he could survive and what it cost and what it was worth. He had a woman who kept a space she couldn't let go of because she hadn't answered the question in it yet, and who brought cookies from 3 bakeries, and who sat on empty floors and told the truth, and who had asked 4 words on a Tuesday evening that she hadn't planned to ask, and had then spent 11 days hoping he'd mean it when he answered. He was going to mean it. That was the decision. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind you announced, just the quiet, daily, renewable decision to stop treating the possibility of loss as a reason to not build anything, to stop letting the careful, reasonable fear of being hurt again outrank everything else, to open the door instead of just maintaining the wall. He went to bed, slept better than he had in a while. In the morning, Mason wanted the dinosaur butter on his toast, which they had, and the Cretaceous ceiling poster absorbed the early light, and the city outside was exactly what it always was: present, demanding, indifferent to individual lives, and therefore somehow freeing in the way that large things were freeing. And in a building in the West Village, on a canvas propped against old brick, a painting that had started with one slash of unplanned red near the lower right corner was slowly becoming something that didn't have a name yet, which was fine, which was how the best things started, without a name, without a plan, with nothing more than the willingness to pick up the brush and find out. 6 months later, on a Saturday in late April, when the city had finally remembered how to be warm, Ava arrived at Ryan's apartment with dinosaur cookies. She'd found a bakery that got the Brachiosaurus neck right. Finally, a fact she reported with genuine satisfaction. and Mason opened the door before she could knock. He had been waiting. He claimed he hadn't been, but he had been. "The pterosaur documentary has a sequel," he announced as his opening statement. "I know," Ava said. "I looked it up. The wingspan estimates in the first one were conservative." "I read that too." Mason stepped back to let her in. Ryan was in the kitchen, and he heard this exchange, and he didn't go to the doorway right away. He stood at the counter and let himself hear it. His son and the woman who had walked into his life through the door of a single unguarded question, talking about pterosaur wingspan estimates in the front hall with the comfortable familiarity of people who had been arguing about paleontology together for 6 months and had developed a rhythm. He heard Ava ask about the Cretaceous city. He heard Mason explain that he'd expanded it to include an early Jurassic district, which had required significant infrastructure negotiation between the resident species. He heard Ava say she wanted to see it, and mean it, in the way she always meant the things she said to his son, without performance, without the managing quality that adults defaulted to with children, just honest interest from one person to another. He heard Mason laugh at something she said, the full laugh, the unguarded kind that came from somewhere real in a child's chest and didn't have any self-consciousness in it yet. Ryan stood in his kitchen and felt the quiet weight of a life that had made room, not replaced, not repaired, not neatly resolved into something uncomplicated, just made room, the way a living thing made room, imperfectly, with scar tissue and leftover grief and a tyrannosaur drawing on the refrigerator and cold coffee and 3 bakeries for the right cookies. He put the kettle on. Then he went to the doorway, and Ava looked up from where she was crouching over the expanded Cretaceous city, and she gave him the real smile, the one that had started in a cafe with a cardamom pastry and had been appearing with increasing frequency in his kitchen and his hallway and his life. "The neck is right," she said, holding up a Brachiosaurus cookie. "Finally," Ryan said. "Finally," Mason confirmed, with the satisfaction of a long injustice corrected. And that was it. That was the whole thing. The pterosaur sequel, and the correct cookie, and the late April light through the window, and the 3 of them in the ordinary living room of an ordinary apartment, and none of it was perfect, and all of it was real. And that was after everything, exactly enough. Later, when Mason was absorbed in the documentary, and the city was doing its soft Saturday evening thing outside, Ava and Ryan stood in the kitchen, and she looked at him over her coffee cup with the directness she'd always had, and something underneath it that was fully present now, in a way it hadn't been in October. "So," she said. "So," he said. "Is this what you thought it would be?" He considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. "No," he said. "It's not what I thought it would be." "Better or worse?" He looked at her. At the woman who had asked a question she hadn't planned to ask, and had then spent 6 months showing up, with cookies, with honesty, with floor sitting and pterosaur research, and a painting in a West Village building, and the patience to learn the rhythm of a life that had been built without her in it. "Better," he said. "Not because it's easier, because it's real." She held his gaze for a moment. "Yeah," she said, "it is." From the living room, Mason announced that the wingspan estimate revision in the sequel was, and he wanted to be clear about this, much more satisfying than the first documentary's conservative position. They both turned toward the doorway. Then they looked back at each other. And somewhere in that small, unhurried moment, the pivot from the kitchen to the living room, from the 2 of them to the 3 of them, from the careful private thing to the ordinary shared life, the question that had started everything finally, quietly, got its answer. Not in 4 words this time, in everything else.